Hello everyone. If you are new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do it, thanks. By the way, I also have a Luffy fan fiction channel. If you are interested, the link is in the description. Doomed to Repeat by Fiachra Ochiern. 1 year after Jiraiya's death, Naruto is no longer the ninja he once was. Faced with the chance to change everything that went wrong, can Naruto rise above the strength of his enemies, the suspicions of his friends, and most of all, his own weaknesses? I don't own anything. Now let's get started.
Chapter 14. Kaoru was prepared for something to go wrong on the bridge. He wasn't prepared for the bodies. "What happened here?" shouted Tazuna as he raced for one of the fallen men. Kaoru scanned the bridge quickly, looking over the handful of workers that had arrived early. Most were dead, and those that weren't were dying, like the man that Tazuna knelt by. "A monster," gasped the man on the stone bridge. It was a monster. A chill crept over Kaoru's skin that was purely physical this time. He knew what the mist surrounding them foreshadowed, and he knew what to expect from the man that had created it. "Not this again," Naruto groaned as the mist grew thicker, but he withdrew a kunai from his pouch and held it defensively. "Surround Tazuna," Kakashi ordered as he took his own position at point. The 4 genin moved swiftly and obediently, Sakura on Kakashi's right while Naruto took his left side. Kaoru stood nearly opposite of Kakashi, at Tazuna's back, with Sasuke between him and Naruto. "So you're still around, Kakashi," the familiar voice issued from the surrounding mist, "with your kids." "I am not that young," growled Kaoru in a futile attempt to wash away the sudden tension that accompanied Kirigakure no Jutsu. "Look, one of them is shaking." Zabuza sounded distinctly amused, and Kaoru's eyes shifted immediately to find Naruto. Naruto's mouth was pressed into a thin line, but he stood resolved and firm. It was Sasuke who held his kunai in front of him despite the tremors that shook his body. Kaoru stretched his hand toward the boy in case he had to jerk Sasuke out of the pit of despair again. But he thought Sasuke was stronger than that. Or maybe he was just mixing up a short genin with the cold-hearted mask that Sasuke could become. A ripple of chakra made the hairs on Kaoru's arms stand on end for a moment before the small, underprepared team was surrounded with 5 identical figures of Momochi Zabuza. One in front of each of them. Kaoru suddenly wondered if Sakura would be able to take her opponent on her own and raised his hands, fully prepared to make twice as many Kage Bunshin as Zabuza had Mizu Bunshin if it became necessary. "Sasuke, go," commanded Kakashi with a lilt in his voice that suggested he was smiling beneath his mask. Which probably meant that he knew something Kaoru had either missed or failed to remember. By the time Kaoru looked back at Sasuke to try to determine what Kakashi was ordering him to do, the boy was already moving. Kaoru could only follow Sasuke because he knew the training, but Kaoru had never been that smooth. A swift slice across the bunshin in front of Kaoru became an uppercut through the stomach of the figure in front of Sakura-chan. So fast that the 2 clones seemed to melt into water at the same time. Sasuke continued his way around the circle and ended with his arms spread wide, crouched in front of Kaoru with a kunai in each hand. "I'm shaking with excitement," Sasuke sneered at the mist with pride seeping into his tone. "Show off," Kaoru scoffed to keep the boy firmly rooted on the ground and in the battle they were currently fighting. He was about to throw out another brief insult. It was his most familiar way of communicating with Sasuke, after all. When his senses brushed against a presence that he recognized only because he had studied it intently the previous day. "Kakashi, there's 2. "I see them," Kakashi interrupted. Kaoru turned his head to the side so that he could just see, from the corner of his eye, Zabuza and Haku emerging from the mist before Kakashi. The giant sword strapped to his back almost made look taller than he was. And Haku's mask successfully hid his youthful face that looked too innocent for a hunter nen. "You were working with him?" Naruto pointed at Haku insistently. "You're a bad guy all along." "Naruto," murmured Kaoru warningly. The last thing they needed was for Naruto to make himself a better target. "You've already seen my Sharingan twice." Kakashi pushed up his Hide 8 swiftly. "No one has seen it 3 times and lived." "I survived your last prediction, copy nin," Zabuza replied easily. "Haku, get the brats." Kaoru heard the trickling of water before he saw the small stream that was gathering at his feet. But remembering Haku also meant he had never forgotten the boy's story. Hated for the power his blood gave him. "Move." Kaoru wrapped an arm around Tazuna's waist and physically lifted the bridge builder off his own bridge. Sakura leapt forward to make room, and Kaoru pulled Tazuna away from the circle of water on the bridge. Kaoru all but shoved Tazuna away as soon as he landed so that he could turn around to face his opponent properly. He wasn't surprised to see a ring of mirrors, clear as glass and cold as ice, enclosing 2 boys in a structure that lowered the temperature enough to create a clearing of the mist. "Shit," muttered Kaoru. He was hoping to avoid Haku's Makyu Hyosho this time. "Sasuke-kun." Sakura yelled and waited for a confirmation that her teammates were still okay. "Your brats are trapped in Haku's jutsu." Kaoru glanced around to look for Zabuza again, but the mist only afforded a vague outline of a man's figure. And from the way he stood, alert and ready for an attack, Kaoru guessed he was staring at his own sensei rather than Haku's master. Gritting his teeth harshly, Kaoru looked over his shoulder at Sakura and Tazuna. Sakura had crawled to her feet and taken position in front of Tazuna, but her attention was divided between Kaoru and the dome of icy mirrors that contained her boys. Tazuna scanned the mist with a fervency that would probably hurt more than help. "You can help them, can't you, Kaoru-kun?" Kaoru's eyes focused back on Sakura at the soft, desperate question. He saw her hope and knew what she was going to say. She wanted him to go and fight while she defended Tazuna. Actually, it might work. Haku couldn't leave the mirrors without dropping the entire jutsu, and as long as Kaoru and Kakashi could keep Zabuza busy, the boys might be able to break out of the jutsu. Kaoru almost flinched. Well, his plans were never deemed as genius, but for lack of a better one. "I'm going to help Kakashi-sensei," he explained to Sakura. "Two of us against one of them. Keep an eye on that dome, but don't call any attention to yourself if you can help it, Sakura-chan." Sakura nodded vigorously, but Kaoru didn't wait to see Tazuna's reaction at being left with a Genin kunoichi for protection. Kaoru brought his hands together once again and reached for his own chakra, not the beast's. 10 Kaorus scattered into the mist to look for their opponent. He wasn't an expert at silent killing like Zabuza was, but Kaoru had the advantage of being everywhere at once. By the time Inari woke, his grandfather had already left for the day to work on his bridge. Inari ate a breakfast of rice and eggs and watched the shortest of the ninja that Grandpa had hired, the one that always wore orange, the one that had called him a crybaby. The ninja circled the house several times before disappearing out of sight. Once, Inari thought he had seen two of the orange-clad ninja at the same time, but he didn't pretend to understand what shinobi were capable of. All that mattered was that Gadu was stronger. That was always true, wasn't it? Inari slipped away to the toilet while his mother cleared the dishes and filled the sink with water that always smelled a little bit like silt. "Inari, come and help me," he heard his mother call. "I'm in the bathroom," Inari answered honestly. The fact that he had timed his trip to the bathroom to coincide with doing the dishes didn't come up in his mother's retort. Inari flushed and pulled up a stool to wash his hands thoroughly. His mother would just check and send him back into the bathroom if he didn't. When Inari turned the stream of water off, he heard a crash from the kitchen rather than the silence that he should have. His first thought was that his mother had dropped a plate or something. That wasn't really like her, but he needs to know that wet dishes were slippery sometimes. "Hey, can we play with her first?" The slimy, amused voice that issued from the kitchen wasn't one that Inari recognized. It wasn't one of Grandpa's friends, and it sounded too evil to want the right kind of playing. Shaking, Inari tiptoed to the door and tried to slide it so that it didn't squeak in its grooves. "Quit fooling around, Zori," commanded a second voice, deeper than the first. "We deliver her to Gadu so that her old man pays attention to what he's supposed to do. That's the plan." The door caught with barely enough room for Inari to squeeze through, but he could see out. Two men, one with light hair and one darker, stood over his mom as she sat heavily, unnaturally, on the floor in front of the sink. The men carried long swords like samurai, and the light-haired one was leering. They were Gatu's men, Inari realized with absolute certainty. His breath caught in his throat with a sound like a strangled dog. The dark samurai's head spun around and saw Inari peeking through the bathroom door. "Hey, a little brat," he noted darkly. "Inari, run," Tsunami shouted desperately. "Can I cut him?" One of the men stepped towards him eagerly. "I really want to cut something." But Inari was frozen in the doorway. The men were going to kill him. They were going to kill his mother. "Stop." His mother only used that voice when she was really mad. Both men turned to look at her while Inari tried to remember how to breathe. "If you kill my son," threatened Tsunami, "I'll bite through my tongue and drown in my own blood. Then what will you do for a hostage?" Inari shivered at the picture. He had already seen the man he thought of as a father die, bleeding, broken, and still so stupidly hopeful. If his mother died, too, maybe he would just let the men cut him. But still, he stayed where he was in the doorway, frozen. "Shit," muttered the light samurai, the one whose sword needed cutting. "Well, he's just a brat, anyway. Come on." The other samurai grabbed Tsunami's arm and jerked her to her feet roughly. "Ta-da, hero time." Inari's eyes widened at the sight of Uzumaki Naruto, self-proclaimed hero, bursting into the house from outside. The boy immediately lashed out against Waraji and managed to slice at the arm that held Tsunami. Waraji cried out in pain and released the woman. "Damn brat," growled Zori. The man withdrew his sword in one smooth motion and quickly slashed at the boy. Naruto jumped backwards, landing less than a meter away from Inari's frozen place. For a moment, Inari was glad of the outside help. He was no good to his mother, but a shinobi had to be better against a samurai than a stupid, frozen boy. "Waraji, get the woman," Zori ordered as he advanced on Naruto. Waraji obediently grabbed a fistful of Tsunami's dark hair and dragged her to her feet, shoving her towards the door. Inari started to watch their retreat, but then Zori charged and his eyes were drawn back to the fight in his kitchen. Inari grasped the frame of the door and watched the small shinobi block the sword again with the short knife in his hand. Then, with muscles of an adult that Naruto hadn't formed yet, Zori pushed the boy back and swung the sword down faster than Naruto could recover. Inari saw the hope he had denied feeling go up in a poof of smoke. He didn't realize that his legs had given until he hit the floor under him. Zori grunted in satisfaction and turned to follow his comrade out the door while Inari sobbed at being left behind while the heroes around him all met the same fate. Naruto stopped staring at the mirrors around suddenly as a sinking feeling began to grow in the pit of his stomach. Inari's in trouble, he murmured with his eyes on the ground. Dobi, growled the dark boy beside him. How do you know? I just know, Naruto snapped. Actually, he wasn't sure how he knew, but he knew that there were two guys with swords in old man Tazuna's house, and one of them was dragging Tsunami out by her hair. Naruto scanned his prison quickly and saw only reflections of the coldness that surrounded him. We gotta get out of here, he decided. Sasuke sneered at him. Naruto thought he was just doing it to look cool in front of an enemy since eye-rolling wasn't really an option currently, and turned his own attention to the figure that faced them. The almost blank hunter mask stared back at Naruto and Sasuke, but as the boy hadn't really said anything, not even to threaten, so Naruto was only paying attention to him as an obstacle along with the mirrors. Well, if Sasuke wasn't going to do anything. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. The many identical copies of Uzumaki Naruto had one goal and only one in mind from the moment they popped into existence: break the mirrors. Naruto, Sasuke called fiercely, but Naruto decided it was too late to stop. Within the mass of clones, each one charged for one mirror, fist raised. But one after the other, the clones dispelled suddenly, and Naruto sunk into the realization that however much of a show-off Sasuke was, the hunter nin was faster. The guy had sliced all of Naruto's clones before any of them even hit a mirror. Idiot, Sasuke hissed. Don't waste your energy like that. Naruto glared back for a brief moment but didn't tell Sasuke that he could make 10 times that many clones if he really wanted to. Can you melt them? He asked suddenly. Sasuke had made a huge-ass fireball during Kakashi-sensei's test, and fire melted ice, right? Sasuke just shot Naruto a confused frown before he returned his attention to the glowering figure above them. I can't break the mirrors, Naruto hissed, hoping that the enemy couldn't hear his plan. Can you melt them? A light dawned in Sasuke's eyes, and he glanced at the ninja above them. Sasuke ran through a set of hand seals that Naruto didn't bother to follow. Pinching his thumb and forefinger together, Sasuke held up his hand to his lips like he was blowing a whistle. Kaden. Gukakyu no Jutsu. The fireball that resulted seemed even larger than Naruto had last seen, and it was headed straight for the masked nen. Naruto could almost bask in the warmth that the fire provided. But then the flames dissipated and the two Konoha genin were once again faced with a mirror of ice holding a flat picture of their enemy. It didn't work, Naruto gaped in disbelief. You won't be able to defeat my mirrors with a jutsu of that level, announced the young shinobi. Okay, that wasn't good. Plan B? Suggested Naruto. A sharp pain shot through his arm before he heard any response from Sasuke. The brief sting was followed by what felt like hundreds of insect bites, only harder. Maybe like thorns or needles. Whatever they were, they hurt. Naruto raised his arms to cover his face instinctively. Eventually, the attack stopped, and Naruto dared to look up again. His jacket was punctured in multiple places, and the legs of his pants were ripped and torn. Beside him, Sasuke wasn't looking much better. In fact, Naruto would almost guess that his teammate looked worse with the deep scratch that stretched just below his right cheekbone. You can't beat me while you are trapped in my jutsu, came the voice from above both the boys. To me, your movements look like slow motion. Naruto was beginning to think that voice was kind of annoying in its all-knowingness. Just because he could, Naruto flipped a shuriken out of his pouch and flicked it in the general direction of the ominous voice. Shut up, he shouted. I'm trying to think here. Don't do that. Sasuke grabbed Naruto's wrist and stilled all motion from the other boy. Naruto decided to ignore this obviously rude behavior for now. We need a plan, Naruto retorted. His plan with the Fuma shuriken had been handy against Zabuza that first time, but that was only a bunshin. And this pretend hunter nin wouldn't fall for the same thing. So, Naruto fell back to the first lesson he had learned under Kakashi-sensei. They were supposed to work together. His grand idea was punctuated with another round of needles flying air between the mirrors. Naruto vaulted to his right while Sasuke dodged in the opposite direction. He felt a couple needles sink into his left leg while one embedded itself into his right left arm, just below his elbow. The needle in his arm was sending tingles down his arms to his fingertips, like it had fallen asleep. Annoyed, Naruto jerked the offending weapon out of his skin, shooting a hot stab of pain down his arm that passed into a dull throb. He could work with that. Naruto looked over at his teammate quickly. Sasuke was still trying to get to his feet while half a dozen needles remained jabbed into both his legs. His dark hair hung in front of his face so that Naruto couldn't tell if the bastard was really in pain or just having trouble with his feet falling asleep like Naruto did with his arm. Either way, he needed his teammate for this. "Sasuke, we need a plan," he repeated loudly. He glanced up in preparation for another attack, but the young ninja just looked down on his prisoners from his place in the mirror. Still keeping an eye on his enemy, Naruto seized the opportunity to dash across the space between him and Sasuke. "Idiot," Sasuke growled as soon as Naruto pulled up to his side. "Stop distracting me. You can't do anything here." Sasuke faltered on his injured legs a little, and Naruto's hand shot out to wrap around Sasuke's arm and give support. Sasuke shrugged half-heartedly as if he was trying to dislodge his teammate's help. Naruto gritted his teeth but remembered to keep his voice low. "We get stronger together," he hissed at the reluctant boy. Sasuke's head snapped around to pin Naruto with a surprised look. Why the hell would Sasuke be surprised? Working together was one of the rules, wasn't it? If Kakashi knew it and Keiru knew it, it had to be important. Naruto just glared back. Sasuke listened to Keiru ni, so Naruto would act like Keiru ni. "Think up a plan, Uchiha," ordered the light-haired genin, "or I'm gonna start hitting things again." It was a stupid threat. He already knew he couldn't break the mirrors, but he knew that Sasuke didn't seem to want him to do it, so it was the best he could come up with. Sasuke turned his head back to stare at the hunter nen, who hadn't moved from his position yet. "He's not aiming for our vitals," Sasuke noted softly. Naruto frowned, then cast a glance down at his own body. It was true that the needles and cuts were mostly limited to his arms and legs, with a few scratches across his stomach just for good measure, but he wasn't sure what it meant yet. "He's not trying to kill us yet." Sasuke looked like he was trying very hard not to roll his eyes as he huffed at Naruto's ignorance. Naruto ignored this yet again. "We're slower than him in here, but he can't keep this up for long." "So, what's the plan?" Naruto fell serious as well. Between him and Sasuke, they could beat this guy, and then they could help out the rest of their team and save the day. Despite the cool and chill that surrounded him, Zabuza found the mist comforting. It was a familiar environment, and one he had worked in for years. The mist effectively blinded not only him but his opponents as well, a perfect defense against a dojutsu like the Sharingan. And with the aid of Mizu Bunshin or even a cleverly thrown voice, the Hitaki wouldn't be able to discern Zabuza's position by sound, either. Zabuza, on the other hand, was a master of silent killing. Even at this distance, he could hear the man's heartbeat. It was calm thus far, heightened only by approximately 8 beats per minute. Enough to blame on nerves, but not enough for the Junin of Konoha to be considered truly frightened. Too bad. There was a certain glee to be found in scaring people out of their wits. But Hitaki Kakashi was a Junin, and he was famous. Copy Nin Hitaki, son of Konoha's White Fang. The first time Zabuza had faced the man, he had underestimated the strength needed as well as the man's secret weapon in his bloodline. Here was a challenge. This would be different from killing that pathetic excuse for a human, Gadu. Defeating Hitaki Kakashi would be hard, but that's what made it fun. Suddenly, something decidedly solid collided with the back of Zabuza's head, driving the man forward so that he had to put out his hand to keep himself from crushing his nose on the cement of the bridge. He quickly used his momentum to execute a half flip in midair, landing crouched and facing his opponent. He was actually surprised to see the red-headed young ninja staring back at him. "Don't suppose you could be convinced to walk away from this?" the boy in front of Zabuza questioned in a tone that was almost disappointed. Well, it was a stupid question, anyway. "No," growled Zabuza, unstrapping the sword from his back. What a waste, to use his meat cleaver against a kid like this. Zabuza swung his blade in a long arc, but it never collided with the flesh of his target. Instead, the boy simply moved to his left, and the sword delved into the concrete by his side. Zabuza frowned briefly. The kid shouldn't have been that fast, he might be able to match Haku. "We don't want to kill you, Zabuza." The boy paid no attention to the deadly blade and merely stepped back out of range. Zabuza noted the unusual pattern of speech and suddenly realized how he had been taken by surprise. The kid didn't have a heartbeat, he was a bunshin. "Then why do you keep trying?" The assassin jerked his blade from where it had sunk into the bridge and balanced it for a moment on his shoulder. Much as he wanted to get back to the killing, a part of him was genuinely curious. "Well, you did try to kill Sensei." The boy's mouth rose into an amused smile that suggested he was far more okay with that than one would suppose a Konoha shinobi to be. Konoha had a reputation among the 5 countries for being soft. They produced powerful ninja on occasion, the Sannin for example or Konoha's Yellow Flash, but on the whole, they didn't know what it was to live in a world where being weak would only get you dead. "You're in my way, kid," Zabuza stated calmly as he pointed his meat cleaver at the kid. "You'll die for that." At the threat, the kid felt serious but not fearful in any way. Zabuza looked into blue eyes that burned hot and wondered just how soft he could expect this kid, real or fake, to be. "What about Haku? demanded the redhead. You want him to die here? A broken tool is useless to its master. Zabuza recited a rule that the kid should have known. Surprisingly, the kid only got angrier. Damn it, Zabuza, he growled. You care about that kid. More than just a tool. What if he dies? Zabuza was beginning to get tired of this. He had a job to do. Killing Hitaki Kakashi was just an added perk, but his goal remained the completion of his job so that he could get paid, killing Gato along the way, and move on. The only one dying here is you, Zabuza announced coldly. Zabuza charged then, wondering at the boy's lack of reaction until the sword came down at the juncture of the kid's neck and shoulder. The resistance of the blade against flesh faded suddenly as the figure in front of him disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Zabuza had been expecting it since the kid had avoided his water prison the same way a week ago. But, since the kid hadn't even bothered to block, did that mean that his only purpose had been to talk with Zabuza? Strange kid. Well, that didn't go well. Hidden in the mist, Kakashi spun to look in the direction of the new voice even though his ears had already identified it. Kakashi-sensei, it's just me. Kaoru raised his hands in an innocent gesture. Kakashi eyed his companion for a moment. Zabuza seemed like the kind of assassin who liked to make his kills personally, but he wouldn't put it past the missing nin to use a deceptive trick. Meanwhile, Kaoru was apparently getting nervous at Kakashi's silence. Naruto's favorite jutsu is Orochi no Jutsu, the young man blurted suddenly. The idea that Kaoru was a disguised Mizu Bunshin quickly flitted out of Kakashi's mind. Showed you that one? Himself lucky that he had never actually seen the devastating jutsu, but he had second-hand knowledge of it through the Hokage. I got some experience with it. Kaoru just shrugged, falling into a more relaxed posture than was probably wise in the middle of a battle. Suddenly, Kaoru tensed again and snapped his head to his left. Kakashi wasn't exactly sure what Kaoru thought he could see through the mist, but it was clear that he had noticed something. Ah, he's gone again, noted Kaoru quietly. He turned to Kakashi intently. My shadow clones can tell me where he is when they dispel, but I can't move that fast. He's gone by the time I know. Kakashi shot Kaoru a glance from his regular eye before he went back to scanning the mist. The others? Kakashi probed, hoping that leadership quality in Kaoru despite his title of genin wasn't a fluke. Sakura-chan's guarding Tazuna at the north side of the bridge, Kaoru quickly reported. Sasuke and Naruto are trapped by the hunter nin about 10 meters back. Kaoru shot a glance over his shoulder, where he said the hunter nin would be. The mist was still pervasive around them, but Kakashi wondered if he had a cage Bunshin looking out for the rest of his team. That kid has a Kekkei Genkai, Kaoru finally announced in a low tone, something with ice. Kakashi nodded silently. He had heard of Mist's unusual interest in bloodlines, or rather, their unusual fear of them. It wasn't surprising that the shinobi who carried such talents ended up becoming nuke nin. You might be smarter than you appear after all. The familiarly eerie voice issued from the mist. Hey, an indignant teen cried. Apparently, Kaoru was enough of an uzumaki to share the shouting enemies down in the middle of a fight trait. Kakashi wasn't sure if he was more exasperated or amused. Haku is the last of his line, continued Zabuza's disembodied voice. A Hyouten user. His bloodline makes him the perfect tool, but he is still too soft. You act like that's a bad thing, bastard. Kaoru glared randomly at the mist. If he needs to, Haku will kill his heart to destroy his opponents. Zabuza's voice had taken on an extra chill, but Kakashi couldn't sense the man's chakra or presence. Can your students accomplish that, Kakashi? Kakashi refused to give any outward sign that Zabuza's question had hit a mark. Sasuke, Naruto, and Sakura were all fresh genin. They knew nothing about killing yet. They didn't know what it was like to take a life for no other reason than because the village ordered you to. Never underestimate Konoha's brats, Zabuza, Kaoru commanded the mist with his half-smile lingering on his face. They got really good eyes. It's true, Kakashi joined in. If he couldn't bluff, telling the truth would work just as well in this situation. Our Sakura was top of her class among kunoichi. Naruto is Konoha's most surprising, unpredictable ninja. And Sasuke has a power that could rival Haku's. You're not the only one with a special student, Zabuza. What about you, brat? Questioned the voice. Surprisingly, Kaoru didn't answer immediately. He stared into the mist as if his blue eyes would suddenly erupt into Byakugan. Then, Kaoru whipped a kunai from his holster and shot it into the mist, about 30 degrees from the direction both he and Kakashi were facing. Kakashi could just catch a glimpse of a blue haze surrounding the kunai, lit by his Sharingan. You'd be surprised what I can see, Zabuza, Kaoru announced proudly. Suddenly, the boy flinched and let his smile fall. Damn, that didn't do much damage, he muttered then turned to Kakashi. I got him under his ribs. So, Kaoru neglected going to find Zabuza himself with knowledge from his clones and had simply launched a chakra-laden kunai. A good plan, but they needed something better than blind target practice. How many clones do you have hunting him? Questioned Kakashi. 8, Kaoru answered immediately. One blue eye suddenly closed in a brief flinch, and Kaoru met Kakashi's eyes again. Make that 7. Can you hold him long enough to lead? The Sharingan was draining, but so was Kirigakure no Jutsu. Unless Kakashi could do some damage to Zabuza before getting injured himself, it would turn into a game of outlasting each other. And Zabuza would be far more familiar with a mist-filled environment than Kakashi. Kaoru kept his eyes on Kakashi's while he processed the request. Finally, the genin nodded and brought his hands together in a simple cross. Yeah, Kaoru confirmed just before 2 more clones appeared on either side of the boy. Go tell the others. The 2 clones disappeared into the mist without a word. Kakashi kept his eyes open and waited. Sakura was nervous. She could hear the sounds of battle, scuffling and grunts and an occasional cry of pain, from the circle of ice sheets that she had been told to watch, but she couldn't see within it, and she couldn't do anything to help. She could still hear pieces of the conversation between Zabuza and the 2 fighting him, Kakashi-sensei and Kaoru-kun. Both Kaoru and Kakashi had such confidence in the 3 youngest ninja on the mission, even though Sakura and her teammates hadn't done anything but D-rank missions so far. Even though Sakura wasn't doing anything but staring worriedly into the mist. Sakura knew all the rules written in academy textbook. But knowing and doing were 2 separate things, and Sakura wasn't even sure how she could help. She stared at the icy reflections and pored through the tomes stored in her mind. None of them suggested a way to break a bloodline jutsu without contacting the instigator himself. Sakura dismissed her head knowledge and tried to recall everything that had happened in the previous fights during this mission. There had been the 2 brothers on the road, but even Naruto could handle those guys. Then the first time they had seen Zabuza, the boy with him hadn't done anything but hide Zabuza's cover. That fight belonged mostly to Kakashi and Kaoru. A sudden recollection appeared like a light bulb in Sakura's mind. She wasn't entirely sure it would work, and if she did it wrong, she might be hurting her teammates' chances more than helping them. But she had to do something. Carefully, hoping the boy encased in ice wouldn't notice her movements, Sakura withdrew 2 kunai from her holster and concentrated. You move well, the masked ninja noted. Sasuke stared back at his opponent calmly. His plan hadn't been great, but it served to keep both him and Naruto alive. Sasuke was faster than Naruto, so he was designated to keep their enemies' attention while Naruto dodged most of the blows by creating cage bunshin and substituting with them so that his clones took the hits meant for him. Thus far, it was working well, but Sasuke knew that he wouldn't be able to keep up his current movements for any long duration of time. Apparently, the boy in the ice knew it as well. But you will not escape from here, continued the boy. If I must, I will kill my heart to become a true shinobi. Sasuke practically heard the response straining at the back of Naruto's teeth, but the idiot had agreed to let Sasuke do the talking as long as Naruto looked for an opening. The one brilliant idea Naruto had was to work together. To get stronger together. Sasuke pushed Naruto's harsh words to the back of his mind. He had no time to think of what that could mean for him, for his ambition. Instead, Sasuke focused on the boy above him as he withdrew 4 senbon in each hand, held delicately between his fingers. Determined to track the path of the weapons, Sasuke blocked out all other distractions, including Naruto's grunts as he tried to remove the needles that he hadn't been able to dodge, and looked. The senbon flew in straight lines, all toward Sasuke. The would-be victim crouched into a low stance, then pushed off the ground with one hand, balancing for a moment in a handstand before he vaulted into a flip and landed facing Naruto. His teammate seemed to be out of clones for the moment and took to staring at Sasuke with wide eyes. Santo, your eyes. He never found the words to describe precisely what he was seeing, but Sasuke knew enough of what he was seeing to fill in the blanks. He could see each of the individual drops of water that littered the ground beneath their feet. He could see all the wounds Naruto was standing in spite of. And when he turned back to where his enemy stood, he could see that the boy wasn't surprised at all. So, you have also inherited a Kekkei Genkai, remarked the boy. You're not the only one who's special, Sasuke scoffed. Teme, Naruto muttered, though Sasuke wasn't sure why, or even which of the 2 boys he was referring to. Stick to the plan, Dobi, Sasuke ordered. Let you run around with your special eyes while I sit around and wait, hissed Naruto under his breath. We need a better plan. Sasuke ignored the hot demand as 3 senbon cut through the air between him and Naruto. The enemy was trying to keep them separated. That could work to their advantage. Sasuke just hoped that Naruto wouldn't jump in too early. Perhaps you can understand what your friend cannot, suggested the boy in the mask. You know how people can fear those of us with power, and fear can lead to hate. Sasuke paid only half an ear to the boy's regaling, but he did hear a strangled sort of gasp come from Naruto on the other side of their prison. Sasuke cursed silently and swore that if the idiot didn't know how to keep quiet, he was going to spend the rest of their missions with a gag in his mouth. My father discovered my bloodline after I was born. The boy was suddenly in a mirror over Sasuke's right shoulder, and Sasuke cursed again for letting Naruto distract him. When he realized what we were, he killed my mother and tried to kill me. A part of Sasuke's mind flashed with the memory of two pale figures lying on the wooden floor, never to rise, never to speak words of pride again, but he fiercely brushed it aside. Itachi would die for that, but Sasuke had to live through this first. Sasuke's eyes caught sight of a brief movement outside the dome, a flash of pink and metal, and he knew what to do. He only hoped that Naruto would catch on. Haku's fight was not going as well as he wanted it to. His goal had been to capture all three of the genin in his Makyu Hyosho, maybe even the old bridge builder. That would leave Hitaki Kakashi and the red-headed Keiru to Zabuza as he wished. Zabuza-sama wouldn't mind Haku being greedy, and in Haku's demonic ice mirrors, he could control the outcome of his fight. Such had been the plan. He hadn't anticipated either of his opponents improving to such a degree that the Dark One could probably match Haku in speed outside of his bloodline jutsu. Even Naruto, who had been kind to Haku, was using ninjutsu where he couldn't use his speed. And now, the Dark Boy had a dojutsu that could track movement, the same as Hitaki Kakashi, the Sharingan that should have been only found in members of the clan Uchiha. It wasn't nearly as developed yet, Haku was sure of that, but it was still a nuisance. He had to finish this quickly. "My dream is to protect the one who is precious to me," he announced to the two boys below him. Haku wondered if Naruto would recognize his words from the morning in the forest. The boy had been paying special attention when Haku started speaking of how he had ended up alone, and Haku hadn't missed his expression of shock. Perhaps for one with a family like Naruto, it was impossible to picture being alone. "You cannot be allowed to interfere with Zabuza-sama." Suddenly, the Uchiha boy charged forward. His eyes could follow Haku's movements, but his own had gained no speed. Haku only realized the reason behind the boy's timing when he saw the kunai sailing towards him from the outside of the dome out of the corner of his eye. But there was enough time to deal with all of this. Haku eyed the boy charging for him and, with one hand, flipped 5 senbon toward very precise targets on the boy's neck. Then, without watching Uchiha's reaction, Haku leaned out from his mirror and caught the kunai sailing for him. Then he saw the second kunai, a shadow shuriken technique. Haku's mask was hard enough to keep the kunai from piercing the ceramic, but the force of the blow was enough to snap his head backwards. "Yada!" he heard the young kunoichi cry triumphantly. Haku ground his teeth behind his mask. He hardly thought a simple hit was enough for such celebration, but then the girl had no idea what was going on within the prison that the ice mirrors created. Haku straightened again with the intention of slipping back into his mirror. He was met instead with a fist in the center of his mask. Naruto wasn't sure what Sasuke was planning to accomplish with a straight-on attack. Hadn't that been what he chewed Naruto out for initially? But, Naruto wasn't about to miss out on a beatdown. So, when Sasuke charged, Naruto charged, too. Then, Haku left the mirrors, and Sakura's yell accompanied a sudden hit. Naruto knew he didn't have much combat experience, but he knew his opportunity when he saw it. With Haku's head bent backward and his eyes on the sky instead of his opponent, Naruto gathered his chakra to his feet and gave an almighty push off the bridge. He cocked his fist back and put all of his momentum behind the punch he delivered right to the damn ninja's stupid mask. The young nuke nin fell back as Naruto's momentum kept pulling him forward, shattering right through the mirror the boy had been in. Naruto fell to the ground and rolled into a somersault to stay on his feet. The boy simply crashed to the bridge and only managed to get his hands underneath him in an attempt to push himself up. "Ha!" Naruto let out a triumphant shout even louder than the sound of tinkling glass behind him. Still grinning widely, Naruto glanced over his shoulder to congratulate his partner in crime. His grin froze when he saw what he had left behind. Sasuke lay face down on the cold cement of the bridge with senbon struck through his neck like a sig necklace. He wasn't moving. "Sasuke-kun!" Sakura screamed into the silence, heavy in the mist, but she didn't move from her position in front of Tazuna. Naruto's eyes stayed fixed on Sasuke. No, couldn't be. He was just faking. This was part of the plan, right? "I see," the enemy's voice broke through the thickness of Naruto's mind. "He kept my eyes fixed on his attack so that I wouldn't see yours." Naruto's throat was suddenly thick and tight, like it was swollen. It was getting hard to breathe. He turned to face his enemy again, but he had to keep his eyes on the ground just in front of his feet. His eyes were burning. "He sacrificed himself so that you could break free of my jutsu." "Shut up," Naruto growled. He didn't want to hear about sacrifice. He never wanted anyone to die for him, especially Sasuke. They were teammates. They were supposed to work together. They were supposed to get stronger together. Sasuke wasn't supposed to be lying on the ground, unmoving, just because Naruto couldn't keep up with him. "Is this the first time you've seen a comrade die?" inquired his opponent, on his feet now. Naruto could almost hear the sympathy in the other's voice, and his face started to get hot. The thought that he was getting a fever crossed his mind, or maybe it was the needles still embedded in his skin that was making his muscles coil and tense like that. "Shut up," he repeated, raising his head. "I won't forgive you." Naruto saw the blank mask, cracked in the center of the forehead where he had struck it. He saw the calm facade of the enemy nin, showing no emotion at the death of one of Naruto's own precious people. And then Naruto saw red. Chapter 15. Inari could still hear his mother's pained cries outside the door as his tears continued to spill down his cheeks. He was still sitting, frozen in the position his weak legs had deposited him into when he had fallen. He was an orphan now. He was going to be alone. Go ahead and pout, then, you big crybaby. Inari's eyes popped open at the memory that was so clear he thought for a moment that the blonde idiot hero had come back to life and was standing in Inari's kitchen. But the words were only in his head, and yet they rang so clearly. He was a crybaby, wasn't he? What would Kaiser think of him? That man had been as close to a father. No, that man was his father, and he would have protected what he loved with his own 2 hands. He would have protected Inari's mother. Ignoring the way his hands shook, Inari pushed himself to his feet. He needed to help his mom. He probably wasn't going to get to be a hero who could save the day, but he had to try. With his cheeks still sticky with the salt and dampness his tears had left behind, Inari clenched his fists and raced out the door toward the voices outside. Let go of my mom, Inari shouted as his feet carried him to the wooden porch that framed his house. The 2 samurais stopped in their tracks and looked back at the boy. Waraji still had one hand fisted in Tsunami's dark hair while she struggled to get her feet under her. Inari froze again, but he balled his fists by his sides and locked his knees so that his legs wouldn't give out from under him. This brat just won't shut up, sneered Zori as he drew his blade. Oh, so you're allowed to kill him? Waraji questioned in a petulant voice. Inari knew he couldn't run, but what could he do against a full-grown samurai? It'll show the old man that we mean business. Zori started back for Inari with a wide grin on his face. And he can always gag the bitch. Inari didn't even register the bad word that came out of the man's mouth as he saw the gleaming sword raised high in the sunlight. Ashamed, Inari bowed his head and said a last word to his father. I'm sorry I couldn't protect anyone. Keiru Ni-san was right. You guys are just a bunch of bullies. The voice was the same. Too cocky for someone so young and too happy for someone who had gone through as much hard times as Kakashi-san had said. But it was still there. Inari opened his eyes and stared, along with Zori and Waraji, at a short, blonde, orange-clad ninja standing just behind Zori. Yura! Came a loud shout as a flash of orange leapt from the roof above Inari's head and landed on Zori's shoulders. Inari barely had time to register the shinobi trick of splitting oneself before he gaped in absolute shock at what the ninja did next. He stuck his finger in his mouth, wetting it quickly, then shoved the spit-slick digit into Zori's ear. Ah! Zori apparently forgot his sword in favor of waving his arms around his head, as if he was trying to chase away a giant bug. Inari's eyes shot to his mother, but Naruto had already taken care of her. One figure of Naruto held his mother with his back to Waraji, protecting her. Meanwhile, the Naruto who stood behind Zori gave a running jump towards the samurai. The war cry that he let out caused Waraji to turn toward his new opponent. So Inari was the only one who saw another Naruto leap from behind Tsunami with his foot extended. A heel smashed into the back of Waraji's head just as a raised fist collided with his nose. Waraji slumped to the wooden planks, unconscious. A sharp cry made Inari look back to the man in front of him. Naruto, one of him at least, was still riding his shoulders, but now the boy had his legs locked around the man's neck. Zori was trying to raise his sword above his head to cut the figure trying to choke him, but he looked more like he was going to chop off one of his own ears. Inari watched the man swing once more at Naruto, who dodged by grabbing onto the man's hair and swinging himself precariously downward. The boy gritted his teeth and did the first thing that came to mind now that Zori's attention was no longer fixated on him. A moment later, Zori flinched and shook off the need to clutch at his injured instep while Inari stood amazed at the damage a bare heel could do with all of his weight behind it. Naruto took the opportunity to plunge his fist into the crown of the man's head as his legs jerked up, cracking the man's neck so loudly that Inari wasn't surprised at all when Zori fell to the ground, taking Naruto with him. Naruto waved his arms frantically and jumped from his perch on Zori's shoulders. He landed in front of Inari easily. Hey, kid, Naruto greeted as if he hadn't just jumped off an unconscious samurai. Sorry about leaving you alone in there. We needed to lure them outside so we could ambush them. Inari stared at the boy in front of him in wonder. It was part of the plan. Inari had helped after all. Swallowing quickly, Inari looked over to his mother. There was one Naruto on either side of her, helping her to her feet while another was messily dragging Waraji out from under the eaves of the house. Mom! Inari's knees were shaking, and his heart was pumping so loudly that he couldn't hear anything else. But his mom was safe, and that was his only thought as he threw himself into Tsunami's arms. Ni-san said that they'd attack here if they couldn't get to the old man, the Naruto on Inari's right side said. Inari raised his eyes from Tsunami's apron, even though he was sure that Naruto was talking to all the other Narutos. Something must have happened at the bridge, answered an identical voice from behind Inari. We need to get there. Right. All four figures nodded definitively. Wait, Inari called as he launched away from Tsunami. Let me help. A couple of the Narutos looked back at him and frowned. But Inari stood his ground firmly. It was a lot easier standing up to this shinobi now that he had already stared down Zori. "I can help," he insisted. He needed to protect what he loved, and his Gramps was in trouble. "I'm not a crybaby." "No, you're not." Naruto's voice had turned oddly serious. Inari looked up at the closest figure, the one that was gazing at him with a sincere smile. "I'm sorry I called you that, Inari," said Naruto. "You were really brave." Inari tried to smile back, but he could already feel his eyes scrunching shut in an attempt to keep his tears in. "We gotta go," urged another Naruto. "I can help you get the villagers together." Inari tried again. He needed to help with this. All four Narutos exchanged glances, and Inari wondered if they had some sort of mind connection or if they were just being shinobi-like and sneaky. "Okay." The lead Naruto finally nodded at the boy. "We could use reinforcements if the old man's in trouble." Inari beamed through his tears. "Watch me, Dad," he whispered in his mind. "I swear I'll make you proud. I'll protect what's precious to me with my own two hands." Kakashi kept both eyes on the shinobi in front of him. It helped that Keiru's red hair stood out in an environment shrouded in gray. Keiru had explained that two of his clones were engaging Zabuza as soon as another clone had dispelled with the exact knowledge of a location. Kakashi had a kunai drawn and all his senses peeled open in an effort to know exactly what Keiru did. Keiru suddenly changed direction, pushing off with his left foot so that he bounded to his right. Kakashi followed easily and opened his eyes wider when he saw three more figures through the haze of the mist. One had his back to the charging shinobi while the other two were crouched into defensive stances, their red hair bleeding through the fog. Zabuza already had his zanbato drawn as he faced two of Keiru's clones. Keiru withdrew a kunai from his holster and launched it at his enemy. Kakashi frowned at the action. All the kunai did was alert Zabuza to his new position against 4 instead of 2. Zabuza reacted quickly, bringing his sword down on one of the clones even as he turned around and craned his neck to dodge the kunai. Well, re against 1. Kakashi held his own kunai in one hand and came between Keiru and the raised sword. Blade met blade with a metallic tang, and Kakashi held his ground. A firm hand grasped his left shoulder, using the older ninja as leverage. Keiru vaulted himself around Kakashi and swung his leg in a wide roundhouse kick at the same time as his remaining clone crouched and swept his foot towards Zabuza's legs. Zabuza released the counterweight of his sword in order to leap over both Keiru's legs. As the blade clattered to the cement, Kakashi charged again. It was strange fighting alongside Keiru. There was no calling of directions or encouragement to each other. It was like fighting beside someone who had known him long enough to know Kakashi's fighting style, like fighting beside a precious comrade. Keiru flipped another kunai at Zabuza, but the nuke nin caught the blade in his left hand, providing him with a weapon to replace his discarded blade. Kakashi stopped short in his charge as Zabuza raised his arm. Suddenly, another form of Keiru appeared behind Zabuza, kunai in hand, and plunged his blade into the upraised arm, right through Zabuza's bicep muscle. Zabuza let out a grunt of pain, high praise for anyone managing to fight a silent killer, and leapt away from his enemy into the mist. "You're doing well, Keiru-kun," commented Kakashi to his partner. "You say that like you're surprised." Keiru smirked back. Kakashi wouldn't use surprised to describe his reaction, but the mind that had labeled him a genius at age 5 did take note of certain things. Unlike during his brief spar against Kakashi some weeks ago, Keiru was apparently having no residual pain from either his wounds or his seals. He even had enough foresight to know what Kakashi was planning. Either that, or he had been a very quick study in the single time that he had fought against the copy nin. A scraping sound made Kakashi turn his head suddenly as his eyes scanned the otherwise silent mist. Keiru stood a step behind the Junin and looked at Kakashi, like to a superior for direction. There was no breeze to distinguish direction, and the mist blocked Kakashi's sight. "Do you see him?" Kakashi demanded. "He trashed my last bunchin," Keiru answered as he turned his own eyes to the mist. "We need a better way of tracking him. I wasn't trained as a silent killer." Kakashi barely heard the breath of air over Keiru's complaining, but it was enough to be almost too late. He looked over his shoulder just in time to see Zabuza approaching, holding his giant sword with his uninjured right hand. Keiru. Responding with an instinct all shinobi learned in battle, Keiru crouched without even looking over his shoulder and tried to roll out of the way. Zabuza brought his blade down in one swooping arc and caught Keiru's side instead of his stomach. Zabuza didn't stick around to survey his handiwork. Instead, he simply disappeared back into the mist, leaving Kakashi untouched while Keiru struggled to rise from his hands and knees. "Keiru," Kakashi hissed in demand. "Ow." The boy pushed the short expletive out through gritted teeth, but he stood up slowly. Then, Kakashi felt a chill travel through the mist, and a shiver crawled down his spine despite his veteran years. This weight, this chakra, was evil. "Zabuza?" breathed the Junin, doubtful already that the nuke nin could produce a killing intent so blatant when he was a master of silent killing. No, Keiru's response was quiet, and the boy wasn't even looking at Kakashi when he answered. Kakashi glanced at the teenager before he followed his gaze through the mist back to where Keiru had said that Zabuza's companion was engaging Sasuke and Naruto. Naruto. That's why the chakra felt so evil. The Kyuubi no Kitsune was out. Kakashi sucked in the heavy air and tasted only the moist surroundings that he had been in all along. The sake that accompanied the Biju's chakra had dissipated into the mist, letting Kakashi think more clearly. This level of chakra was nowhere near what had paralyzed almost the entire village of Konoha that dark night more than 12 years ago. The seal had not been broken, only slipped slightly, but it was still a problem. Keiru, Kakashi called intently. They had to take Zabuza down quickly so that Kakashi could tend to his student. Keiru, however, had not moved from his spot. His wounded side was dripping over the hand that he clutched to his right side, and the glove he wore in the same fashion as Kakashi was already damp with blood. "We don't have time for this," declared the Junin, Naruto. "I'll go to Naruto," Keiru interrupted suddenly. "You'd be better to deal with Zabuza." Kakashi frowned at the boy. Sandame had informed him of Naruto's status as jinchuriki, and Keiru himself had proven that he knew something about seals. But how did that translate to Keiru being the best to take care of the Kyuubi, if that was his intent at all? "Keiru," Kakashi began, fully prepared to pull rank and report the oldest genin on the mission for insubordination if he refused. Suddenly, Zabuza emerged from the mist again, wielding his meat cleaver with one good arm and a bleeding side. Keiru jumped backwards so that the large blade crashed into the cement between Kakashi and Keiru. As the former mist assassin jerked his sword out of its newly created cradle, Kakashi saw Keiru turn as if to flee the scene, dashing to the end of the bridge straight towards the source of the chakra. "Guess the kid didn't have such good eyes after all," commented Zabuza as he heaved his sword up to rest on his shoulder. Silently, Kakashi studied his opponent as long as the opportunity presented itself. One arm still hung limply by his side, and he was bleeding from the kunai that Keiru had caught him with blindly. It would take just a bit more to bring him down, and now Kakashi had to worry about two uzumaki somewhere beyond his sight in the mist. "Well," Kakashi sighed, reverting to his laid-back, hip attitude easily. "Let's get this over with." It annoyed the hell out of enemies when they thought their opponents weren't taking them seriously. "I've got better things to do." The seal had only slipped, Kakashi reminded himself as Zabuza faded back into the mist. If nothing else, he could hope that Naruto remained Konoha's #1 knuckle-headed, hyperactive, surprising ninja. Naruto felt his knuckles crack as he flexed his hands and curled them slowly into fists. Before him stood a figure in a mask, the one who had killed Sasuke. Naruto bared his teeth and charged. He could see the boy twist his hands into symbols as he dodged to one side and knew that he couldn't be allowed to finish. Naruto changed directions even before Haku stopped moving and seized the older boy's right wrist. Haku made some kind of soft exclamation. Naruto only heard the pain conveyed in it and turned his eyes on Haku's mask. That stupid, fake face always staring down at them while attacking, being better than Naruto. He hated it. He clenched his right hand into a fist, dimly aware that his nails were digging into his palm. Then, with Haku still trapped in his grip, Naruto thrust his fist into Haku's face. His enemy flew backwards, but Naruto didn't even give him a chance to recover. He leapt forward. His legs felt even stronger than when he first discovered he could make it to the top of the tallest tree in the forest. Haku's head was bent unnaturally backwards, but Naruto wanted more than that. His fist uncurled into a more base attack. His fingers still curled like he was going to rip off Haku's mask with his bare hands. Naruto caught up to Haku's form and dragged his curled fingers across the boy's chest. He could feel fabric tear and flesh part easily beneath his hand. A cry pierced the air, but Naruto paid no attention. Haku's body hit the stone and skidded to a stop while Naruto stood a meter in front of him, surveying his fallen prey. Someone was calling, someone familiar. But the boy was now getting up, pushing himself off the ground unsteadily. A fierce sound escaped Naruto's throat as he couldn't be moving. He should stay down, stay dead. "Naruto, snap out of it." A strong arm wrapped around his stomach and held him in place. Naruto struggled against it. He needed to get to his enemy and kill him. He clawed at the arm that held him without looking at the body that accompanied it. "Naruto, stop," shouted that familiar voice again. A pair of hands clamped down on his shoulders and jerked him backwards. A face suddenly appeared in his scope of vision. A round face, topped with blood-red hair. "You think you're gonna save anyone like this?" demanded the face, with those eyes. Eyes. The stranger's eyes were blue and snapped with the force of fire. "Keiru." Naruto lowered the hand he had drawn back and stared at his cousin. Keiru stared back, and now that his eyes weren't burning, Naruto could see the concern shining through. "Ni-san?" All the strength Naruto had felt coursing through his veins suddenly left him. His skin felt clammy. He could smell blood in the air, like wet metal. A glance over Keiru's figure proved that he was steadily dripping crimson onto the bridge from a gash in his right side. Naruto's eyes caught a lethargic movement behind Keiru, and he gaped. The figure standing up slowly raised one hand to push aside the remnants of a broken mask. As the ceramic pieces clattered onto the concrete beneath them, Naruto recognized the feminine face that was revealed. "You're that kid." It was the same kid that Naruto had mistaken for a girl. The one who had declared that Naruto would become strong. "Why did you stop him?" the kid asked in a quiet voice. His dark eyes were fixed on Keiru. Naruto dared to let his eyes flicker to his cousin's visage. Keiru lifted one hand off Naruto's shoulder and turned so that he faced Haku more directly. But he kept his other hand on Naruto's shoulder. Naruto liked the feeling of the weight of that hand. "I don't want him to lose his heart," answered Keiru finally. Naruto swallowed hard. Haku had 4 wounds across his chest, seeping blood slowly and staining his already dark clothes. He had done that. Naruto felt sick. "You protect him," Haku noted. The only sign that the wounds affected him at all was the quietness of his voice. "As long as I live." Keiru's response was almost as quiet, but it was as firm as Iruka had declared that Uzumaki Naruto was a shinobi of the leaf and not a demon fox. Naruto saw Keiru's face shift slightly so that he could look down at his little cousin. "Sasuke," Keiru whispered in a voice only for Naruto. Naruto flinched but didn't dare look back to where he knew Sasuke's unmoving body still lay. His throat grew tight, and his eyes dropped. Naruto's throat constricted, and he couldn't continue. He felt the hand on his shoulder squeeze gently in some form of comfort. Keiru dropped his hand then. Naruto immediately missed it, but he raised his head to see what was happening. Keiru was facing Haku with his back to Naruto, like he was shielding him. "I saw you in the forest," Keiru announced. "You didn't want to kill any of us, not even Naruto." Naruto stared at Haku. He hadn't thought of that. If Haku had been working with Zabuza from the beginning, why didn't he kill Naruto when he had the chance? "Tell me why," demanded Keiru calmly. "You're with someone like Zabuza." The question had a purpose, as had Keiru's intervention. He didn't want Naruto to carry the guilt of someone's blood on his hands when the boy wouldn't even remember the reason he was killing. Naruto's ability to understand his enemy was too precious to lose so soon. Keiru only knew now that it was what had inspired those who had been his enemies, like Gaara, and even those who would rather have doubted him, like the shinobi of Konoha, to believe in Uzumaki Naruto because he demanded it. Datbeo. "Do you know what it is to be hated for something you cannot control?" asked Haku calmly. "To be feared because of a power you never asked for?" Keiru's stomach twisted with the affirmation that wanted out, but he remained silent. This was Haku's story, not his, and he doubted Haku was even looking for an answer. "I was born in a snowy village in Mizu no Kuni," explained Haku. "My parents were kind people, we were happy." His right hand slowly rose to cradle his chest, cupping for a moment to catch the blood as if he was going to press it back into his body. "But those with Kakai Genkai are feared, especially in Mist Country. When he discovered my mother's bloodline and that it had been passed to me, my father tried to kill us. My blood protected me, but I was left with nothing. The villagers drove me out. I realized then that I was an unwanted person. No one would care if I died in the snow." Naruto had relaxed enough to come stand beside Keiru, his ears and eyes intent on Haku's story. Keiru wondered how much Naruto realized that Haku's story paralleled his own. "Zabuza discovered me and took me in. My bloodline could be useful to him. That which everyone else feared and hated, he desired. I was to become his tool." Haku paused long enough in his story to smile fondly. "I was happy," Haku declared. "It was my dream to protect Zabuza, to help him in everything, but now." Haku raised his head and stared at Keiru. Keiru tensed, not entirely sure of what would happen next. Then again, he had a pretty good idea. "Please, kill me." "What?" Naruto shouted. "What the hell?" Keiru knew why Naruto was protesting, but he didn't stop it. He knew this part. He had lived this part. Now it was time for Naruto to do so. "Why would you die for a bastard like him?" One of Naruto's arms flew up to indicate the mist beyond the tattered fighters. "He's a bad guy who takes money from criminals." "Why?" "You said that it was your dream to become the strongest ninja in your village," Haku answered as his eyes flickered from the shorter Uzumaki to the calmer one. Naruto suddenly swallowed what his question had been and shifted in his stance. His left foot came up against Keiru's right leg, as if he was reassuring himself that Keiru was still there. "What would you do if that dream was no longer yours to pursue?" Keiru twisted his fingers inside his fists and wondered how to answer that question. He had lived in a world where Hokage was a joke, where the position was filled by a half-blind, decrepit, old man who made deals with the devil. Literally. But that wasn't Naruto's dream. Not really. Naruto wanted the same thing as Keiru had once: acknowledgement. Haku's dream was merely to be useful to the one who had saved him from the darkness. "Kill me," Haku demanded again. Keiru did not move. "Naruto, go to Sasuke," he ordered. He felt the boy beside him look up at him. Confusion was the predominant feature seeping from Naruto's skin. But Kaoru still didn't take his eyes off Haku. "Now," commanded the teenager. There was still a chance. Kaoru prayed it was a good one, though he don't know what kind of god had ever listened to him. That Sasuke was alive, like last time. Even if he wasn't, Kaoru doubted that he could bring himself to kill Haku. He just didn't want Naruto deciding to take up the boy's offer instead. Naruto obediently, albeit reluctantly, backed away from the confrontation toward his fallen comrade. Kaoru waited until he was sure that Naruto was concentrated on Sasuke. It might not have been the best place to send Naruto just after recovering from a bout of Kyuubi's chakra, but Kaoru just needed him away. He wasn't sure what he was going to do if he was forced to kill Haku, this time in a way so he would succeed. Why did everyone he felt for have to die before his eyes? Kaoru shook his head firmly, chasing away thoughts of empty roads and lost friends. He knew how important Zabuza was to Haku. Knew it better than Haku or Zabuza suspected. But Haku didn't have to die. He didn't have to pin all his hopes and dreams on one person. If it came down to it, he'd offer the boy a place in Konoha. Never mind that he had no idea how he'd managed to convince Kakashi, much less Sandame of it. Sometimes he really wished that Ru could have rubbed off on him. He could really use a plan about now. Sakura held another kunai in front of her, but her body refused to move. She had gone from absolute elation when her technique worked, catching the masked nin in the forehead, to horror when the mirrors had come crashing down to reveal Sasuke's unmoving body. Then, Naruto had changed. His movements were fierce and feral, and the feeling that had come with them, like the mist around her, was actually heavy, pressing in on her and making it hard to breathe. Using nothing but his hands, Naruto had slashed through Haku's chest and left him bleeding. She was aware that she screamed, but it had sounded so far away. She knew that she had almost cried when Kaoru had suddenly appeared and started yelling at Naruto. Now, Kaoru was staring at the boy in the broken mask. Haku, Zabuza had called him. Sakura could hear their voices, but not the words being said. It seemed like neither side was in a hurry to attack. Naruto slowly backed away from Kaoru and trudged his way to the middle of the bridge, where a dark boy lay. Sakura followed his movements to Sasuke's form as if she couldn't help it. Suddenly, she felt a larger, steadier hand slip into her own free one. "I'll stay with you," Tazuna whispered. His voice was far from the usual boasting cry that he spoke with. "That way you can keep protecting me." "Yeah," Sakura murmured. Her fingers closed over the wrinkled hand, and she led the way to the center of the bridge. With Naruto providing backup, Sakura felt confident enough to pocket her kunai and kneel beside her longtime crush. Naruto immediately crouched on one knee and braced both hands against Sasuke's side. "Don't move him," Sakura snapped in desperation. Whatever knowledge stored in her mind had to be put to use, and she knew that if Sasuke was injured anywhere near his spine, then moving him could do more harm than good. Naruto just stared at Sakura with wide eyes, pleading for something. "We can't leave him like this, Sakura-chan," he demanded quietly. Sakura bit her bottom lip silently. It was true, she hated seeing Sasuke, always so proud and cool, lying face down on the cool stone of the bridge with senbon decorating his neck like a painful collar. Other than the needles in his neck, there were several embedded in his arms and legs, but his back was unmarred. Carefully, Sakura nodded her permission to Naruto. Her teammate heaved without so much as a grunt and flipped Sasuke to his back while Sakura cradled the still head, careful not to let any of the needles sink deeper into his skin. Sasuke's eyes were closed, and a trickle of blood was smeared across the corner of his mouth. A large bruise colored his forehead blue and purple, probably from where he had fallen. But his expression was quiet, peaceful almost, as if he were just sleeping. Sakura almost brushed his hair back from his face gently, like a mother would, but the words that seemed so far away stopped her. "You're annoying." Shaking her head to rid herself of memories, Sakura pressed her first two fingers to the inside of Sasuke's wrist, like she had learned in class. She held her breath and prayed that it was only the blood pulsing in her ears that made it impossible to find his pulse. But even pressing her fingers against his skin so hard that they turned white, Sakura met only a silence that filled her stomach with rocks. Sakura swallowed hard against her dry throat, and still her words were only a whisper. "He's so cold." She couldn't even say the words. She didn't want to. She could feel Naruto's sharp eyes on her with an intensity she had never seen from him. Oh, he could be eager, begging for a new mission or a more challenging jutsu. But this was different. His eyes were practically burning. Sakura couldn't meet his gaze and focused on Sasuke's calm face instead. "Sasuke-kun," she called, even though she knew that he couldn't answer her. Naruto stood up abruptly and turned away. He stood stock still in front of Sasuke's body, facing Haku and Kaoru, who were still standing in their face-off. Sakura's fingers stretched further, abandoning their task of finding a pulse in favor of wrapping around Sasuke's wrist. Sakura knew all the rules the Shinobi Academy had ever made its students memorize. She had all the highest marks on all the tests the Academy had ever given to her class. Even so, there was nothing she could do. Sakura suddenly followed Naruto's gaze, just to make sure they still weren't in any danger. Keiru's left arm was wrapped around his stomach and clamped over a slash just below his rib cage. Sakura could see the dark stain that seeped through his already dark shirt and wondered how much blood a person could stand to lose. She was probably the only one on the team that had paid attention during the class on first aid and medical jutsu, and she still couldn't do anything. It wasn't until a sob choked its way out of her throat that Sakura realized she was crying. Haku had failed. He knew he had, and yet he wasn't as ashamed of it as he thought he would be. In failing, he had failed Zabuza-sama, and that should have been unforgivable. But Haku didn't think he minded losing to a young, bright, smiling ninja who only wanted the strength to make other people see him. He had seen the desperation and loneliness in the boy's eyes when he spoke of his dream, and Haku, having lived it once, had recognized it for what it was. The boy was alone. But then the other Konoha shinobi had appeared, and all traces of sadness had left Naruto's face when confronted with one he called brother and the dark one he fought with. Naruto had them like Haku had Zabuza. Which also explained why the redhead, Keiru, had been so fiercely protective. The only thing that Haku was still puzzling over was why the teenager seemed so reluctant to dispatch an enemy. "I don't believe you," Keiru announced suddenly. The sluggish beat of Haku's heart suggested that it would be a long time before Haku died from this battle. Haku stared at the boy staring back and pressed his hand harder against his bleeding chest, confused both at the boy's abrupt manner and his obvious surety that something was wrong. "Not about your dream." Keiru shook his head suddenly as he clarified. I know what it's like, being alone, I know." Haku looked, then, really looked, at his opponent. His eyes were almost the same as his younger brother's, but these older ones were laced with something else. This boy had lost. Perhaps that was why he had sent Naruto away. He didn't want to lose anyone. Then, Keiru's eyes fixed themselves onto Haku. "But you don't have to give up your life." He was silently pleading with Haku to understand, and Haku thought he did. It was Keiru who didn't seem to. "Zabuza-sama has no use for a broken tool," Haku explained. Zabuza-sama was all that Haku had, and all that he wanted, as well. "Do you have many precious people?" Haku guessed that was the barrier that separated him from Keiru's understanding. Anyone who had so many people to live for couldn't understand the hopelessness of losing the one person in the world who gave you life. As predicted, Keiru hung his head and stared at the bridge between them. "Yeah," he answered. Then, he raised his eyes again, and all pleading, all desperation, had been replaced with quiet belief. "You're one, Haku." Haku was sure his surprise showed on his face. The boy didn't even know him, how could he? A sudden sound grew in Haku's ear, like a flock of birds were suddenly fighting over scraps of food. An image of his master's body picked clean by scavengers made Haku's heart stop only momentarily. Then he felt the controlled, focused sake, and he knew exactly what was happening. The mist was dissipating slowly but surely. Haku brought one hand in front of his face and started the seals he knew he would need. Keiru's eyes widened, but Haku didn't pause to consider the redhead anymore even when he lunged in the direction Haku knew he had to go. There was still a way that he could be useful to Zabuza-sama. Kakashi firmly with his left hand, bracing himself against the thin strands of blue light that danced over his skin. "Zabuza, your ambition is too great," he announced as the lightning of Chidori crackled and swallowed up his hand. Zabuza was currently immobile, held in place in the clearing mist by half a dozen of Kakashi's ninkin he had summoned with the scent of Zabuza's blood already in their noses, courtesy of the kunai Keiru had planted in the man's arm. "You're trying to destroy this country's courage," explained Kakashi. "By destroying this bridge, you destroy their hope." Zabuza just glared, unforgivingly, at his enemy. "Your ambition sacrifices too many people." Kakashi held his hand up and looked at the nuke nin through the blue light of his jutsu. "That's not what a shinobi should do." Kirigakure or konohagakure, shinobi were taught the same in both. Power and skills were meant to protect the people of the village, the country even, not for personal gain. "I don't give a damn," growled Zabuza. "I fight for my own ideals, and that shall continue." Not if Kakashi rammed him through the heart, it wouldn't. Kakashi lowered his hand to his side and slid his left foot in front of him in preparation for a charge. "I'll say it once more," declared the Konoha ninja, "surrender." Most of the other countries said that Konoha had gone soft after the Third Great Shinobi War. For himself, Kakashi liked the ideals better as they were now. Saving teammates and sparing enemies was much more in line with what Obito probably would have done. From the glare that Kakashi received in return, however, he was sure that Zabuza would have spit in his face were his mouth not covered. That was answer enough. Kakashi pushed off the ground with his left foot and charged. Zabuza couldn't move, he was going to die. By the time Kakashi saw the thin, sheer wall of ice rise from the water gathered on the ground, he was moving too fast to stop. His arm swung around at the same time as he saw a dark form fly from the ice. "Kakashi!" The voice that called to him was angry, desperate, commanding, all of the above. And then, suddenly, Kakashi found himself frozen in a very strange situation. The opponent facing him was not Zabuza but the boy, bleeding from a chest wound and wearing an expression that was quickly fading from grim determination to wonder. It was the boy who had stepped from the ice in front of his master to protect him from a killing blow. A blow that never reached him. Kakashi's hand still crackled with living energy, but his wrist was encased in a firm grip that refused to let go despite the burning electricity that encompassed it. Kakashi grit his teeth and tried to glare at the interference, but as soon as he met blue eyes framed by choppy red hair, he faltered. Even with the wrong hair color, the wrong facial features, the wrong height, the eyes were something completely familiar. For a moment, Kakashi was a newly made Junin, being held back by a blonde man with blue eyes that turned from water to lightning in a matter of seconds. I'll say it again. The most important thing to a shinobi is teamwork. Stop, ordered Keiru in a low voice, completely unlike his suggestions of what to do or even Naruto's demands of the best ass-kicking way to complete a mission. Keiru just said it as if he expected to be obeyed. His face was eerily lit by the chidori in Kakashi's hand. Keiru's other hand was clamped firmly onto Haku's shoulder, preventing both his victims from moving while the dogs still held Zabuza. All figures remained frozen. Silently, without really knowing why, Kakashi let his jutsu go and let the world return to its normal sunlit state, free of mist and dry lightning. Damn, he didn't know what he was doing. Well, currently he was standing between Haku and Kakashi, doing his best. You will listen because I have enough power to kick your ass from here to Kumogakure impression. It always worked with Kiba. Although, Keiru had to admit, it was a lot different facing down Hitaki Kakashi than a hot-headed Inuzuka one had wrestled with as kids. Still, Keiru resisted the need to heave a giant sigh of relief as Kakashi's chidori faded from view. Lightning chakra was weak against wind, and Keiru's hand was encased in his own, natural chakra. He could barely feel the strain on himself, so focused he had been in staring down his former sensei. With the chidori gone, Keiru let the wind chakra around his hand dissipate. Now, he just had to find a reason for jumping in like that. Keiru opened his mouth to spit out an excuse. Right now, he was probably going with claiming that Haku wasn't an enemy, and Kakashi could always kill Zabuza at a later date. But then he heard the shift in the air. Tensing in a way that immediately let Kakashi know something was wrong. Keiru tightened his grip on Haku and jerked the boy away from Zabuza as he simultaneously dropped Kakashi's wrist. Without any hand signals, Kakashi dismissed his ninkin, allowing Zabuza an attempt to turn. Then, Keiru heard the sick schlick of metal sinking into flesh. Zabuza's eyes widened and looked down to take in his own body. It wasn't until he turned completely to the west end of the bridge that Keiru saw the spear clearly. It had embedded itself into Zabuza's back, just off-center of his spine. His right lung was most likely punctured, but still he remained standing. Keiru craned his head without moving to glimpse his newest complication and cursed through gritted teeth. "So, you're getting your ass kicked," Gato sneered through thin lips and white teeth. He tapped his cane on the cement and grinned with all the confidence of a man who had perhaps 30 men at his back to do his fighting for him. How disappointing. Chapter 16. Tasaka Gato knew the power he wielded. He had known from the time he took control of the shipping company from the Wave Country native. An old man who was perfectly contented to let things continue as they had for the past 40 years. Gato had seen the potential for power in the enterprise, buying or forcing out his competition through a variety of unsavory means. By the time he was the only means available for transportation on or off the slew of islands that made up Nami no Kuni, he practically owned all forms of muscle used for illegal operations or even by the ones foolish enough to try to undermine his own operation. Gato knew. Power was control, and for some reason, he had been slipping lately. He thought that little demonstration a year ago would have been sufficient. Publicly executing a man just for displaying a strength independent of Tasaka Shipping Corporation was on the extreme side, after all. But then that old man had started this idea of a bridge. The large edifice threatened Gato's control on the country, and he had advertised, subtly, for a large sum to anyone skilled enough to kill him. Enter the nuke nin from Kiri, Momochi Zabuza, along with a little tagalong that had absolutely no respect for power. But they were willing enough to do the job, so Gato had hired them. Not that he was actually willing to shell out his precious funds. Gato greeted the scene before him with only slight disappointment. He had actually been hoping that the shinobi would do him the favor of killing each other while he waited. No matter. He had 32 men with him, loyal to his funds if not his power. The dark boy that came with Momochi was at his side in an instant, removing the weapon and laying the wounded demon down on the bridge. Gato noticed, and sneered at, the tender look on the boy's face as he supported his master. "So, that didn't kill you, Zabuza?" Gato questioned. "Pity, I was hoping I wouldn't have to deal with you after this." There were still the Konoha shinobi to deal with as well. The masked one at the forefront likely would take more than one man to bring down, and there was a red-headed teenager beside him who was glaring at Gato with a passion usually reserved for insects. He was probably a naive young brat who didn't know what happened when people came up against those in power. Momochi was horizontal, now, with the boy holding his head up like a dying man. Pathetic. Gato was glad they were out of commission. although he still owed that brat for spraining his wrist. Beyond the front lines, there were 3 kids in the middle of the bride. No problem, especially considering that 2 of them were hovering around the third's prone body. The problematic architect was furthest from the fray, but at least they had him. Waraji and Zori should have been coming from the village with their hostage momentarily. So by the time all the shinobi were dispatched of, the man who dared to defy Tasaka Gadu would have no choice but to yield. Maybe Gadu would kill him, anyway, because the people obviously needed another demonstration of the consequences of trying to make their own way without the shipping corporation. Gadu knew his own power. As long as he controlled the populace, as long as he kept people so afraid that they didn't dare act out, he had power. Momochi, for all his fearsome reputation, had failed to calculate for Gatu's power. Despite the many deaths he had seen, horrors he had witnessed, even the lives he himself had taken, Keiru hated very few people in the world. Select members of Akatsuki were among the top of the list, not because they had been after him but because of who they had killed in their effort to get to him. Danzo was up there as well. The man had to die for what he had done to Konoha, turned it into a place ruled by fear instead of love for the village. Keiru might have hated Gadu as well. The man reminded him of an overgrown bully, like the kind of kids that used to kick up the sand in the box where he played as a kid just because they knew that the boy with lines across his cheeks had no one to defend him. But Gadu was a wimp. He couldn't even face down his allies without 30 guys to do his dirty work. Keiru might have hated Gadu, if he wasn't already convinced that the man wouldn't live out the day. Demon Momochi Zabuza, down by a simple spear, sneered Gadu. It seems you're just a baby demon, after all. The absolute arrogance that Gadu was radiating was starting to get annoying. Keiru briefly wondered if that could be considered irony, since he had hardly been the picture of discretion back when he was still blonde. The thought made him chuckle. The sudden huff of air out of his lungs aggravated his wound, and Keiru wrapped his left arm around his stomach again. He was sure that Zabuza's attack had slashed through the seals that covered his torso from waist to rib cage, but he wasn't sure what kind of damage he was dealing with yet. The marks on his arms were holding like they had been, and the Shikifuin around his navel hadn't been disrupted. So, Tazuna went to Konoha for help. Gatu's eyes traveled from Zabuza and Haku, straight over Keiru, and onto the copy nin. You won't leave this bridge. That was a threat, clear and clean, and the only taunt that Keiru needed. His free hand dove into his holster for a kunai. Reliant on a wispy, blue energy, Keiru let his wind-natured chakra envelop the kunai and flipped it at his enemy. Suddenly, a spasm, like a pinched nerve, rippled down his right arm and made his fingers go numb so that he couldn't even feel to guide the kunai as it left his fingers. Keiru trapped a pained grunt behind gritted teeth and balled his right hand so tightly that he could feel his nails digging through the glove he wore. The glowing blade ripped through the man to Gatu's left and continued, nicking another man's arm and sending 2 of Gatu's cronies down. Keiru felt Kakashi tense and turned his eyes to his temporary genin teammate. Damn, muttered Keiru. I was aiming for the old bastard. You might want to work on that, Kakashi replied dryly. Keiru was too busy trying to determine if the burning he felt all along his arm was his nerves giving out or something worse to bother responding. Meanwhile, Gatu's calm seemed to give out in the face of the precision assassination of one of his men. It doesn't matter, he called as he bravely hurried back into the safety of his crew. You're outnumbered, and you're already injured from your own battle. You'll be easy to kill. Half right. Keiru brought his hands up, one already coated in blood, into a familiar cross. Injured they might have been, but he had a surefire way of evening the odds. With a murmur, 20 separate Keirus lined up across the bridge, facing down Gatu and his hired muscle. Suddenly, Keiru's stomach turned in on itself in a way that he knew wasn't because of the cut or the blood. His throat convulsed, and he swallowed, tasted bile burning at the back of his throat. He bent in half at the same time as he felt all the clones he had just produced go up in smoke, and he couldn't stop the cry that tore itself from his throat. This was going to be a problem. Naruto couldn't look at his teammates. Sakura was still sobbing over Sasuke's body. He could hear her sniffles and loud, wet gasps for breath behind his back. She hadn't asked what had happened in the trap that he and Sasuke had fallen into. Naruto didn't want to tell her. He didn't want her to know that he was responsible. It was his fault that Sasuke wasn't moving. The mist was clearing well. Naruto could see both sides of the bridge now. Simply because he didn't want to have to turn back to Sakura's tears or Sasuke's cold body, Naruto looked up to where the others had disappeared to. No one was fighting anymore. In fact, Zabuza was just lying on the bridge next to Haku while Keiru and Kakashi stood next to them both and stared down a large group of obnoxious-looking punks at the end of the bridge. In the lead was a fat old man with a walking cane more than any practical use. Naruto saw Keiru knee fling a kunai towards the asshole that was talking at the unmoving, bedraggled line of shinobi, and Naruto started forward intently. He saw the sheer damage that the kunai did and stopped, suspecting that his older cousin didn't need his help. It only seemed confirmed when the 20 copies of Keiru popped up. Then, suddenly, they all disappeared just as quickly. Naruto's eyes widened as Keiru bent over and cried out. Naruto tried to look over his shoulder to check on his teammates, but his head refused to turn. He blinked away the burning at the back of his eyes and ran forward. "Naruto!" Sakura shouted from behind him, but he didn't turn around. Naruto hurtled toward his cousin and skidded to a stop between Keiru and Kakashi. "Keiru ni-san," he called desperately. Keiru's right knee hit the damp concrete hard. Naruto's arm came around his cousin's shoulders, but Keiru remained upright. At least halfway. His breath came out heavy through gritted teeth, and Naruto worried that he was going to see two of his precious people fall to the bridge. Haku hovered over his master even as he took stock of the strange situation he found himself in. He wasn't dead, which was a bit surprising after he was sure he was going to give his life for the one who had saved him. But Zabuza's wound was far too serious for Haku to do anything about. Besides the fact that his left arm had been stabbed through and his side had been slashed, his breath sounded wet, and the gaping hole in his back was still bleeding heavily. Haku's first aid usually consisted of patching Zabuza's wounds away from the battle site, packing them with the proper herbs to make sure there would be no infection or fever. Zabuza was already bleeding out, and nothing short of a fully trained Iryo nin would be able to save his life. The boy's head turned slightly to study his sudden comrades. The boy, who was a few years older than him, if that, knelt on the bridge and held the wound on his side tightly. He was obviously in pain and obviously trying to hide it. The way Uzumaki Keiru clenched his teeth made Haku suspect that his stomach wound wasn't the only thing he was struggling against. But Uzumaki Naruto supported his older relative. Haku still thought the boys were brothers. There were enough similarities between them, with a fierce determination that looked almost out of place on his young face. "Kakashi-sensei," coughed Keiru roughly. "I know," murmured the silver-haired man. "I used up too much chakra with Chidori and Kachiuse. This won't be easy." "Easy?" Keiru gaped. "I can't even make shadow clones, and you're—" Keiru burst into a fit of coughing before his rant could form properly. His free hand rose to his mouth and caught the blood that sprayed from his parted lips. Haku's calm, dark eyes flickered to the man that his master had thought the greatest threat. It was subtle, but Hitachi's breath was shallow, not like it should have been. The wound that Zabuza had initially given him had apparently not healed fully. "What about Sakura and Sasuke?" Hitachi demanded. Haku saw Naruto's throat convulse in a dry swallow and remembered the hot, evil chakra that issued from the boy when he had seen his teammate laying on the cold bridge. "Back with Tazuna," Keiru interjected quickly. "They can't help us." He said nothing of Sasuke's condition or Haku's part in it. Naruto set his jaw and stood up straighter. "Then I'll just have to kick all their asses," the boy shouted. He raised one fist in the air while the other remained wrapped around Keiru's shoulders. Haku stared at the boy. That face. He knew it. It was almost like the face he knew he himself wore when he knew he would die for Zabuza-sama. Except he hadn't died. Keiru hadn't wanted him to die, and Haku suspected that Naruto didn't, either. The protests that the boy had raised when Haku demanded to be killed were those of an innocent. Naruto had never spilled blood before, and yet, Haku knew that the younger boy was willing to do so in defense of his comrades, of his brother. Haku glanced back down at Zabuza's form. The man's eyes were closed, but Haku could still hear his heart beating sluggishly. "Naruto-kun," Haku called quietly. He laid Zabuza's body flat on the concrete beneath him and slid his arm free from behind his charge's back. Haku looked up to meet the eyes on him. Keiru and Naruto stared at him while Hitachi kept a firm gaze on the crowd at the end of the bridge. "Please, don't fight." He stood carefully, feeling the damp front of his gi heavy with blood. Keiru watched his movements intently while Naruto just looked befuddled. "Zabuza," began Keiru. "We are no longer your enemies," Haku announced. There was no reason to fight these shinobi. Gato had betrayed them, and Zabuza was dying on the stone. "You never were, Haku." Keiru's face was turned away now, staring at the bridge with unfocused eyes. Then, he looked up again with a crooked smile that spoke of loss and gain all at once. "We were just on different sides." Haku looked at the young man who had lost so much and then at the boy who clung to his precious person protectively. "This is getting boring," Gato announced from in front of the line of wounded, haggard shinobi. "If you're not going to fight each other, at least die quietly." Haku's hand slipped further into his sleeve and reappeared with 4 senbon clutched in between his fingers. "I'm not going to be able to stop you, am I?" The question from Keiru was quiet, almost pained. Haku glanced back at him. Keiru really did want to save him. No one had wanted that. No one had cared before Zabuza. Haku smiled gently at the wounded young man who could have been his friend, had circumstances been different. Then, he confidently stepped to the forefront of the line of defense, putting himself between the Konoha nin and Gatu's troops. "Thank you, Keiru-san," he said. Haku flashed through the one-handed hand seals that provided him with one last ice mirror. He had his destination in mind before he even stepped into the familiar icy portal. Feeling his chakra connect to a small puddle at the end of the bridge, Haku emerged from the mirror that sprang up between the crowd of poorly outfitted samurai and the flimsy bridge that led from the end of the bridge down to the large boat they had arrived in. With their faces still turned towards the place where the boy had disappeared, the group of samurai didn't even realize that they lost 2 members, way in the back, as soon as Haku drove his first 2 senbon into their heads at the base of their necks. Both men slumped to the concrete, instantly dead. Their comrades looked up when they missed their friend's presence. Haku saw one man wearing a flat straw hat turn on his heel. Before the man had a chance to plant his foot and regain his footing, Haku sent a senbon flying with deathly precision. "Shit!" a voice called from beside him. Haku flicked a single senbon into the man's throat without even looking. They knew he was there, now. Half the men had turned around to seek out their new threat while the rest remained staring down the potential threats that the konoha nin still presented. Haku wasn't worried about the ones he had left behind, however. He was faster than Gatu's hired samurai, and Hitaki was still well enough to fend off any sword wielders that ventured out of Haku's range. Leaving a trail of dying or gasping samurai behind him, Haku cut his way through the crowd of men to his destination. The stout man's eyes widened behind the film of his glasses just as Haku caught his wrist in a clawed hand. "I won't break your wrist this time," Haku murmured. His harsh grip was merely a formality to prevent the cowardly man from escaping as he seemed so desperate to. Haku felt the blade enter his stomach from behind and knew his time was limited. Frozen in his position, he lifted one hand before his bloody chest and formed the necessary seals. Sensatsu Shaisho. The water beneath Haku's feet, condensed from Zabuza's mist, flew up as if rain had decided its direction for a moment. Then, the water gathered, sharpened, formed thousands of projectiles into a weapon that Haku was familiar with. With a thought, all the cold needles flew at Gatu. The corporate man had no way of combating a weapon made of chakra as the needles found all his vital points. The wounds didn't even bleed. Haku felt the world grow from the narrow sight of his 1,000 needles embedded in Gatu to the men around him who had suddenly realized that their enemy wasn't moving after his attack. Haku felt another sword pierce through his left lung. He coughed at the foreign intrusion, and a wet, warm combination of blood and spit trickled down his chin. Gatu was already dead. Haku didn't think the samurai would know what to do without him. Which meant that Naruto and Keiru might have a chance of their own, like Haku had had. That thought made Haku smile even as his grip on Gatu's arm released. Kakashi watched the boy fall, his Sharingan memorizing the path of the body as it collapsed with his victim, punctured by 1,000 needles that Kakashi could no longer see. Haku was dead before he hit the ground, and still the same goons that had watched their leader become an icy pincushion now stabbed at Haku's bloody body repeatedly. "Stop it," growled a low voice. Kakashi glanced over at the 2 boys beside him. Naruto stood with his head hung down so that his eyes were shadowed. He had released Keiru, who still knelt between Naruto and Zabuza's body, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. Kakashi shifted his weight subtly. It wouldn't be good if Naruto lost his head, and there was still the danger of Kyuubi to consider. Kakashi still had no idea why the seal had slipped or how Naruto had gotten it under control again. Although considering the way Keiru had rushed off, perhaps it was safer to say that Keiru had gotten things under control. "Stop it," Naruto repeated, slightly louder, at the brutes near the end of the bridge. Keiru pushed himself off the bridge and staggered to his feet. The wound was still bleeding, and Kakashi was growing concerned. Those images on Keiru's arms were not for show. "Stop it," Naruto finally exploded, "you bastards, assholes." Far from aggravating the remaining enemies, Naruto's cries only served to remind them that there were still opponents to deal with. The men turned away from the broken body to look at the 3 conscious, if not battered, shinobi. And now, Kakashi, a bleeding teenager that could barely stand, and a pissed genin had to deal with about 20 men with swords. "You brat," one of them growled, "you killed our paycheck." Kakashi would have raised his eyebrows at the faulted logic of the statement, but his concentration was on the threat in front of him. Keiru slowly withdrew a kunai from the holster on his thigh while he kept one hand on Naruto's shoulder. The younger boy had his teeth gritted, but the contact seemed to get him under control. Shouts of agreement rose up from Gatu's men. It seemed they realized that their commander, and Money Pouch, was dead. "You think you can stand against us?" yelled a man in the front of the pack. "We'll pillage the whole village and take anything of worth." Kakashi brought his hands together hurriedly. He didn't have enough chakra for another Chidori, much less to summon help. But maybe he could get by with some cheap tricks. Suddenly, a bolt flashed past the 3 shinobi, and the lead man cut off his threads with a short arrow notched in his chest. Kakashi thought for a moment that one of his genin had thought to intervene. The thought was cut short by the piping announcement. "If you dare come into our village," shouted a young voice that didn't quite make it through without breaking, "we'll come at you with everything we got." "Hell yeah," agreed a far more familiar voice. Kakashi glanced over his shoulder to see dark-clad men, and some women, holding pitchforks, fishing spears, and plain wooden clubs gathered on the land where the bridge jutted out from the Nami no Kuni coastline. Inari led the charge with a strange metal cap that Kakashi suspected had been one of his mother's kitchen bowls. Perhaps more surprising, though, were the orange figures peppered throughout the front lines of the crowd. "Don't worry, boss." One of the clones waved vigorously at its creator. "We got this one." A clatter of metal made Kakashi focus back on Gatu's crew, but he soon discovered that he had no need. One of the men had dropped his sword. Back to the boat. The cry was immediately obeyed as all leftover thugs turned tail and ran for the thick rope bridge that led to the barge that had carried them to the bridge in the first place. Kakashi's shoulders slumped with the sudden release of tension, and his gaze traveled back to survey the results of the battle. "Nice job, Gaki." Kaoru clapped his hand on Naruto's shoulder once as the villagers cheered their success and sudden bravery. Naruto said nothing in acknowledgement, which was slightly strange in and of itself. Then, Kakashi's eyes fell on the still, silent figures in between the three standing ninja and the villagers. Sakura knelt in front of Tazuna, beside a still, dark body that Kakashi recognized. Sasuke wasn't moving. For a moment, all he knew was the blackness, and all he could hear was the slow, steady beating of a heart that he wasn't sure was his own. He didn't know exactly where he was or why it was raining on his face. He could have been sleeping, but even in his hazy state of awareness, he couldn't remember dreaming. He remembered that there was something wrong with his surroundings. There was something that he should be concerned about. Maybe it was that pressure on his chest. He peeled his eyes open heavily. "Sakura," Sasuke called as soon as he caught sight of the pink hair hovering over him, "your arm's heavy." Sakura raised her head suddenly. Her face was a soggy mess of tears, with pink eyes and cheeks from crying. "Sasuke-kun." She sobbed and fell onto the boy. Sasuke couldn't stop the groan of pain that emerged from his clenched teeth. His entire body felt bruised and sluggish, like all his limbs had fallen asleep and didn't want to wake up. Sakura apologized profusely as she helped him to sit up. The old man, Tazuna, stood over them both, smiling in a knowing manner that Sasuke didn't think he liked. "What happened to that masked kid?" demanded Sasuke. The last thing he could remember was being in the trap with Naruto, but they were getting out. "He and Naruto were fighting," Sakura explained hurriedly. "Then, something weird happened. Naruto had some kind of jutsu or an attack that made him stronger. I don't know. Kaoru-kun came in, and he stopped them, but then they both disappeared, and Zabuza got killed." Sasuke was finding it hard to pay attention to Sakura's explanation with her deep gasps after her sobs and rush of words that followed them. But he pieced together that both the masked ninja and Zabuza was no longer an issue they had to deal with. "Sasuke-kun, I'm so impressed you were able to prevent any critical injuries." Sakura looked ready to envelope him in a relieved hug. "No," Sasuke started to shake his head but found that his neck wouldn't obey his movements without pain. But Sakura was wrong. That masked kid had never intended to kill him. He hadn't even taken the obvious bait that Sasuke provided in order to let Naruto get a simple hit in. Sasuke gently craned his neck so that he could study his surroundings. There was a crowd of people standing behind him at the end of the bridge. Kakashi and Kaoru stood near the end of the bridge with Naruto, all staring back at him. Naruto had a strange, disbelieving expression on his face. Sasuke quickly turned his head again so that he didn't have to look at that expression. Instead, he raised one sore arm in an acknowledging wave that turned into a simple gesture. As Naruto practically leapt forward to return the gesture, Sasuke wondered what exactly had happened between Naruto and Haku after he had fallen. "Nice job," Kaoru repeated, softer as okay. Haku hadn't killed him. The villagers had rallied behind Inari. With some help from Naruto, it seemed, and the idiot bullies were driven off. Gato was even dead again, and Kaoru knew that he wouldn't miss the bastard. He seriously doubted if anyone in the world would. Naruto shrugged off Kaoru's hand as he darted forward to return Sasuke's half-wave. Bastard was still arrogant as ever. "I see," Kakashi remarked. "So, Sasuke made it. That's good." Kaoru felt a sharp pain in his stomach and turned his head to cough into the crook of his elbow, muffling the sound. He felt the wetness before he saw the damp stain on his sleeve as he pulled his arm away. Great, now he was coughing up blood. Like he didn't have enough to worry. A rasping breath cut his thoughts short, and Kaoru snapped his head to pin the source. The still figure on the bridge hadn't moved from where Haku had laid him, but apparently he wasn't quite as far gone as everyone assumed. Kaoru took a few steps on unsteady feet and knelt next to Zabuza. "Not dead yet?" he asked, more curious as to the state of Zabuza's speech than the state of his soul. "Sorry to disappoint." The bandages that covered Zabuza's mouth and chin were stained pink and crimson. Kaoru lifted the kunai in his right hand and dragged it lightly across the man's cheek. The bloody strips of thin cloth fell away limply as a thin, steady stream of blood diluted with mucus and spit flowed from the corner of Zabuza's mouth. Kaoru had seen too much death to be disgusted, but he turned his head away anyway, thinking that Zabuza might not like an enemy to see him in such a state. "Kid." The soft demand caught Kaoru's attention, but he kept his eyes on Naruto. who was running to greet Inari while his clones punched each other in order to dispel themselves. "Where's Haku?" Keiru glanced down at Zabuza. He was almost surprised that there wasn't any threat or animosity in Zabuza's gaze. Then again, maybe it wasn't that surprising. The question was simple, and Zabuza was expecting the answer to be as well. "He's already waiting for you," answered Keiru as his eyes flickered to the abrupt, unfinished end where the bridge dropped into the ocean. "Let me see him." Zabuza's voice sounded wet, and blood was the only thing that Keiru could smell. The man was dying. "Yeah," Keiru agreed, tucking his kunai back where it belonged. He lifted Zabuza's right arm, the one that he hadn't cut his way through, and forced the new nin to sit up. Placing his shoulder at Zabuza's waist, Keiru ducked his head and heaved so that he was carrying Zabuza over his shoulder, bracing the man's legs against his chest. Keiru grunted at the strain the man's weight put on his wound, but he wasn't about to refuse Zabuza this. He knew how much the man really cared about his tool. Keiru approached the bloody mess at the end of the bridge where Haku rested side by side with Gatu. Gritting his teeth, Keiru shoved Gatu's body away roughly with a solid plant of his heel. The limp body rolled away, then slumped to a stop with his blank face turned to the bridge. Fitting, Keiru thought, since the bridge was Gatu's greatest downfall anyway. Keiru knelt down and tried to ease Zabuza off his shoulder as gently as he could. Despite the clenched teeth and a couple very close to abominable expletives, Keiru managed to catch Zabuza's head before it made a solid connection with the concrete. He didn't want Zabuza to crack his head open before he had a chance to say goodbye. Zabuza looked into Keiru's eyes as the boy lowered him to the bridge beside the boy that had been his tool and his one companion. Keiru didn't think the look in Zabuza's eyes constituted gratitude. At least, he wasn't expecting a "thank you" out of the man. If anything, Keiru would place it as understanding. Keiru hoped he was right and nodded solemnly at Zabuza. Satisfied, Keiru stood and watched Zabuza shakily raise one hand to close Haku's glazed eyes. Keiru looked to the water of the strait that separated Nami no Kuni from the mainland of the elemental countries. Could he have done anything differently? Maybe if he wasn't so focused on his own team, he could have approached Haku and Zabuza? Keiru scoffed. Then, they wouldn't have believed him, anyway. Kakashi had washed the strangest of all his genin, and that was saying something. Carry the dying Zabuza and lay him next to an already dead Haku with no small amount of interest. Keiru was bleeding heavily from the wound in his side, and Kakashi hadn't missed the smudge of blood on his chin that proved there were probably more injuries unseen that Keiru had to deal with. Yet, Keiru carried the man across the bridge without a word. Curiosity piqued, Kakashi turned from the scene of Naruto chatting with the villagers as Sakura tried to pick the needles from Sasuke's skin as delicately as she could. By the time Kakashi reached the red-haired figure watching the waves, the only thing Keiru was standing guard over was two bodies of a couple former enemies. Kakashi stood silently beside the teenager, once again affecting his hip attitude, and becoming very surprised when he found that it wasn't as easy to slip into as it had been. Keiru just looked back to the bodies on the bridge with a face that one usually wore to funerals. "I wanted to save him," murmured Keiru. Kakashi followed his dull blue gaze to the boy with dark hair, the one who notably hadn't killed Sasuke. "You knew him?" The thought occurred to Kakashi that Whirlpool had been destroyed during the reign of Yondaime Mizukage, when bloodlines were practically hunted and stories like that of Demon Momochi Zabuza were almost expected. But Keiru would have been too young to remember clearly that kind of reign. And that in no way accounted for the fact that Kakashi had seen Keiru and had thought of Sensei. "I was him." Keiru's answer was strange and not at all what Kakashi was looking for. "Keiru." Kakashi forewent the hip attitude in favor of being a commander. "Before coming on this mission, did you have any contact with Momochi Zabuza or his apprentice?" Keiru was silent for a moment, his eyes still fixed on Haku's body. Then, he drew in a deep sigh and rolled his shoulders back. "No, Junin Hitaki," he huffed as he met Kakashi's glare, before Team 7 was assigned the mission to Wave. "I didn't know them." He paused before completing his sentence as if he had to find the right words. "I saw him in the forest once." Keiru suddenly nodded at Haku, "but I didn't know him." Keiru raised one hand to the back of his head and rubbed at his neck. Kakashi filed his answer away and wondered if he should press the issue. Keiru didn't seem to be lying. A shinobi could pick up signs more quickly than most. Increased heart rate, shifting eyes or weight. Keiru had none of those. At the same time, he worded things carefully. Then, Keiru met Kakashi's eyes once more, and the declaration that followed dismissed thoughts of treachery for the moment. "Naruto used the Kyuubi's chakra to fight Haku," said Keiru without preamble. "Don't let him do that again." "Me?" Kakashi's wide eyes were the picture of innocence. Or, they would have been if the Sharingan would stop spinning. "What do you think I can do?" "He looks to you, Kakashi-sensei," Keiru answered. "You're important to him." Kakashi fell silent and tugged his Hide down again to cover his Sharingan. He knew that Naruto had practically no one close to him. Kakashi had once been in the same state, but Kakashi had been there by choice, not force. Now, Naruto had a brother figure in Keiru as well as a team in Team 7. The only worry Kakashi had was if the two started to pull in opposite directions, which one would Naruto follow? Keiru stood beside Kakashi as the three younger kids knelt in front of two day-old graves. He had been slightly surprised that Kakashi had helped him with the bodies, but then again he didn't remember ever burying anybody the first time around. Kakashi must have done it himself. Naruto was tugging at the grass in front of him but otherwise remained. Why did he want to die? The blonde suddenly blurted. He wasn't a bad guy, why did? Naruto's eyes were dry as he trailed away, but no one attempted to answer his question, even if Keiru was the only one who remembered the cold request. Keiru sighed. Haku had once again shared his story with someone he thought could understand, and Naruto would understand. Haku was willing to do anything for Zabuza, announced Keiru, even die for him. His eyes were fixed on the graves. Zabuza's Zanbato was plunged into the ground behind his headstone, while Haku's was decorated with a chain of flowers that Sakura had picked. No one can stand the pain of being alone. Keiru kept his arms folded across his chest and ignored the feeling of a single, observant eye on him. It's human nature to avoid it, no matter who we choose to save us from that hell. Zabuza saved Haku from his own loneliness. Because of that, Haku followed him faithfully, even if it meant that Haku would spend the rest of his life as a tool. So, was Haku right about shinobi? Sakura ventured quietly, that they're just tools? For a shinobi, it is more important to be a tool, concluded Kakashi for his students. The duty to the village comes first, even for the shinobi and konoha. Even you believe that, Kakashi-sensei? Sasuke, still bearing a bandage on his forehead where he had hit the bridge, turned to the two figures behind him. His raised eyebrows were the only visible sign of his interest in the ongoing conversation. There was a pause as Kakashi's eye shifted from Keiru to the graves of his two enemies. Every ninja has to cope with that rule, he finally answered. Zabuza and Haku acted as tools, even if they couldn't deny their humanity in the end. Naruto's head sank lower as he fisted his hands into the grass. Is that what it means? That's all we are? His voice was low, more of a growl than his regular boisterous spirit. Keiru stared at the young genin. He had thought, hoped, that Naruto would remain Naruto. He had wanted the boy to hear Haku's story. Naruto needed to learn the rules somehow, and what better way than from those who had taught Keiru? Haku had been the first to show him how painful loneliness could be and how important it was to protect those who were precious to him. Screw that, Naruto growled and stood up. If that's what it means to be a shinobi, I don't want it. Sasuke and Sakura looked up at their teammate suddenly, surprised by the uncharacteristic solemnity on his face. Does that mean you're quitting, Dobi? Sasuke demanded. Naruto's head snapped around to pin his rival with a determination that made his eyes look like lightning. Hell no, shouted the boy. I'm going to change it, I'm gonna make my own nindo, and when I'm Hokage, everyone's gonna follow it. Sasuke's mouth turned up into an amused smirk at Naruto's declaration. Sakura just shook her head in exasperation. As for the redhead, Keiru couldn't stop his face from breaking out into a wide grin. Now, that was what he wanted to hear. If he wasn't able to survive, at least he would make it possible for things to go right this time. Keiru had already failed, but he wouldn't let Naruto do so. Naruto would get his chance to become a Hokage unlike any other. Except perhaps Yondaime. Having declared his intentions, Naruto nodded once and stomped away from the gravesite, followed by Sakura, who was just beginning to lay into him for his disrespect of sacred areas like graves. Kakashi followed his two most rambunctious students as Sasuke slowly brought up the rear. Keiru remained rooted to his spot for another minute. Slowly, he brought his bandaged palms together in front of his chest and bowed his head. I'm sorry, he whispered to the two people he hadn't been able to save. He hadn't been strong enough, even now. He hadn't been strong enough to make Haku see that he already had more than one precious person. Or maybe Haku knew it and merely chose to give his life for the one that still, always, meant the most to him. If they had lived, if they didn't have to fight anymore, would they both have chosen to live peacefully? No one had goals of being called a monster when they were young. Had Zabuza had dreams as well? He'll be stronger than me, Keiru declared, not sure if he was even speaking to Zabuza and Haku alone anymore. I promise. Chapter 17. 6 hands, all with the same nick at the base of the left thumb, supported a large post from its base as the ropes attached to the top of it grew taut. Arms pulled and strained, feet planted into the ground, and muscles heaved. Then the long pole shifted into place and sunk into the hole dug for it at the end of the bridge. Yata! Shouted 3 different figures of Naruto as they all pumped their nicked-up hands in the air. Well, that's done at least. Tazuna pushed the ratty hat back from his brow and looked up proudly at the tall post that would eventually become the Torii gate in front of his bridge. Looks good, guys, Naruto called down to the workers below him. Perched on top of the opposing post on the north side of the bridge, Naruto could oversee everything while his clones helped out with the work. He thought it was a pretty good setup. Naruto, Get down from there and help us. Well, it was a pretty good setup until Sakura-chan thought he was being lazy. Naruto grimaced as he perched sideways on the post, then ran down the wooden post until he kicked off the wood beneath his feet and flipped onto the hard concrete of the finished bridge. Sakura shot him a suspicious glare. He really hoped she wasn't going to tell him off for being lazy, but then she said nothing and turned back to stirring the concrete that would hold the posts in place. It's not fair that you don't do any work around here, huffed Sakura. Even if you are more healed than Sasuke-kun and Kakashi-sensei. But, Sakura-chan, we're working, one of his clones protested loudly. That doesn't count. Sakura gave the cement a particularly hard jab. Now, children, Kakashi sing-songed as he approached his students. Sakura paused long enough in her work to shoot her sensei a brief glare, but Naruto cowed at being caught arguing with Sakura-chan. Still, he couldn't let the flawed reasoning go. Shadow clones count as working, Sakura-chan, Naruto repeated. I get all the experience after they dispel, so it's like I'm working, too. It's memory differation or something. Keiru Ni-san had explained the basics when the whole team had needed patching up after their battle. The reason Naruto had known that there were two guys with very sharp swords at Tazuna's house was because his clone had known it and then transferred the knowledge to Naruto. Memory diffusion, Sakura corrected half-heartedly. Naruto just shrugged at the correction. Keiru had explained it better. He said that Kage Bunshin was a tool, like any other jutsu. So the clones couldn't think of themselves as independent. That was Naruto's mistake in Kakashi-sensei's first test. He spent too much time arguing with his own clones. Whenever Keiru Ni fought with his clones, they never needed to be told what to do. Naruto was still working on the whole obedience thing. His clones tended to rush into things with more enthusiasm than planning. Naruto sidled up to Tazuna and watched the man beam proudly at his new bridge. The shortest worker of the day bounded up to them both with a smile on his face that rivaled Naruto's. Hey, Naruto, isn't this great? He demanded. We got it finished. Naruto grinned at the boy. Inari had been great during the week of working on the bridge. Since Inari would only listen to his grandfather or Naruto, the hyperactive genin had been unceremoniously given the responsibility of the kid. For some reason, the kid kept following Naruto around, trying to help where he could. Yeah, it's great, Gaki. Naruto borrowed Keiru Ni's favorite nickname for him as he rubbed his knuckles across the boy's head roughly. He didn't really mean to sound so sarcastic, but he wasn't used to such devoted attention from anyone. Kakashi-sensei was his sensei, but he was also in charge of Sakura-chan and Sasuke-teme. Naruto remembered a time when Hokage Jiji would visit him in his apartment, but he was the Hokage. He had a lot more to do than just visit troublesome orphans, and Naruto knew it. That Konohamaru kid sometimes followed him around, but that happened less often now that the new round of academy students had classes daily. Keiru Ni-san was really the only one who constantly stuck with Naruto now. Even that was a new development. Naruto was more used to being alone than being a brother. Well, we should go home for lunch, Tazuna announced, rubbing his hands together briskly. Yes. Naruto pumped one fist into the air as his clones disappeared with an audible poof. He flinched when he felt the onslaught of experience, and he had to look down at his hand to check for the nicks that his clones had gotten carrying the pole. But his hands were clean. What about Sasuke-kun and Keiru-kun? Demanded Sakura-chan. Sasuke will find Keiru, Kakashi answered confidently. Keiru had been at the bridge but then sent back to check on Tsunami when Inari showed up halfway through the morning. When Keiru hadn't returned, Kakashi had commanded Sasuke to follow the teenager. When Naruto had demanded that he go to fetch his cousin instead, Kakashi had just smiled and replied that Sasuke would know where to look. Kakashi-sensei could be a bastard sometimes. Come on, let's go. Inari cried eagerly and pulled at Naruto's hand. Fine. Despite himself, Naruto smiled. Food would be good, and he wanted to see where Keiru Ni-san had gotten to. Sasuke kicked a rotten log in front of him and watched the wood splinter and fly in large, damp chunks. Keiru wasn't at Tazuna's house, hadn't even stopped by once he left the bridge. Sasuke knew where the older boy was. The same place he tended to visit when he wasn't working on the bridge or talking with his team, mostly to Naruto. Keiru never explained himself whenever he came back from the forests. He rarely explained anything about himself. Although Sasuke still remembered the conversation that had revealed exactly what had happened on the bridge while Sasuke was unconscious. Keiru had been sitting on one of the few chairs within Tazuna's house, shirtless so that the markings that stretched from his rib cage to his waist were visible. Naruto stood beside his cousin with a palette of ink and a well-used brush. Sasuke and Sakura sat on the floor in front of the pair. Sasuke staring at anything but his teammates. He was determined not to show his curiosity. Kakashi was sitting in a corner of the same room, flipping through his orange book with an intensity born of perverse concentration. Naruto ran his teeth along his bottom lip as he concentrated on Keiru's wound. The gash on Keiru's right side had faded to a puckered pink line that cut through the twisted black markings. Naruto loaded his brush with ink and traced the broken lines over the scar tissue on Keiru's side. Keiru flinched at the first contact of the ink on his skin, but then his eyes caught on the two in front of him. "Don't worry, Sakura-chan." His cringe suddenly turned into a cocky grin. "I heal fast. Something me and the brat got in common. I'll just watch out for giant swords from now on." A glance over at Sakura told Sasuke that the girl wasn't quite convinced yet. She twisted her fingers together almost nervously and frowned at Keiru before she lowered her eyes. "Naruto, I want to know," she began hesitantly. "What did you do on the bridge?" "Huh?" was Naruto's intelligent response. Sasuke raised his eyes to the boy and silently demanded him to catch on. Sakura hadn't been able to explain fully what had happened with Naruto, only that he had become suddenly stronger. When Sasuke was. Sakura's eyes darted to the boy in question, and Sasuke scowled at her. He didn't need to be reminded that he had succumbed to Haku's superiority. If the boy hadn't deliberately kept him alive, Sasuke would have been dead for real. When he was unconscious, Sakura amended. "You and Haku were fighting. Was that a jutsu, or a bloodline?" Sasuke nearly scoffed at the idea of an idiot like Naruto having a Kekkei Genkai. Then he saw the way Naruto's face paled while his hand froze with the brush a breath away from Keiru's Skina clan to have a bloodline. "Sakura," Keiru interjected calmly. Ignoring Naruto's frozen state, he focused on the young kunoichi instead. "Uzumaki was never a clan. There's not even." The cutoff was harsh and violent in a way that Keiru's words almost never were. But Sasuke saw the older boy's eyes flick over Naruto's taut figure before they dropped down abruptly. An older brother regretting or wishing to protect, Sasuke wasn't sure which would be a more accurate description. "It's more like shared traits," Keiru sighed and took up his explanation again. "Shared traits?" Sakura repeated, apparently oblivious to any lingering tension. But the question erased the last remnants of melancholy from Keiru's face. "Y'all ever seen Inuzuka fight?" he inquired and watched Sakura lift her face in thought. "It's like that. Adrenaline does funny things to us." Sasuke remembered the Inuzuka, the boy who had graduated with him and his teammates, even Naruto. He always had a white puppy with him, and when he got angry, he sneered and growled like he was more animal than human. "What kind of funny things?" questioned Sakura. "Have you heard of fight or flight?" Keiru's blue eyes pierced Sakura with the question. When she nodded, he continued. "We don't get to choose flight. Increased speed and strength. Even our aggression goes way up." He raised one hand and counted off the attributes on his fingers as he listed them. Even Naruto's eyes were on Keiru now, which meant that Sasuke had a hard time determining his reaction. When Sakura had first posed the question, Naruto had almost been panicked. Now he was hanging on to Keiru's words as if he were trying to memorize them. "But it doesn't last, and the letdown can be worse than coming off opium," finished Keiru. "It's a rule. Number 356 or something. Power always costs something and the shortcuts cost more than they're worth." Sasuke rounded a tree with old scars on it, slashes across the trunk reaching up to the canopy. Power. He hadn't thought about Itachi since the battle on the unfinished bridge. At the time, he had been too preoccupied with recovery and then trying to figure out what had happened during his state of oblivion. But now Naruto, and maybe Keiru as well, had a power that made them stronger, even if Keiru treated it like a curse instead. Sasuke ran his hand over the kunai marks on the tree as he passed it. Training with Naruto and Keiru, it had almost felt normal. And then, Sasuke had fought with Naruto inside that cage of ice. With Naruto. With a dead last student who shouldn't have even graduated were it not for extenuating circumstances that Sasuke still wasn't fully aware of. Something about a remedial test with Iruka. But Naruto had fought with him. He had shaken Sasuke out of a stupor of failed plans and actually helped him fight. And then Sasuke had formed a plan that had gotten himself killed. Well, not really killed, but the fact that he had woken up was moot point. If Haku wanted, if he had been a real ninja, he could have driven those senbon deep enough into Sasuke's neck to sever his nerves and ensure that he never woke again. And some part of Sasuke, some deep, dark part that sounded like either his father's stern tone or Itachi's cold command, berated him for dying so easily when he was nowhere closer to his goal than he had been when he graduated academy. Sasuke didn't pay close enough attention to it to find out which one he was hearing in the depths of his mind. He kicked at a loose stone in the ground and forcibly shoved the thoughts to the back of his mind, determined to bury them along with this mission. He was supposed to be an avenger. No one else could share this with him. Not even someone who treated him like a brother might. Keiru stared at the grave markers and wondered, not for the first time, what peace his sensei ever found by staring at the dead. Then again, maybe peace wasn't the right idea. Either way, whatever Kakashi found at his friend's memorial site was missing from this place. Keiru had been staring at Zabuza and Haku's graves for days and still hadn't come up with any brilliant insight or sudden illumination. He hated to beat himself up over things he couldn't change, so he tried not to think about how things could have gone. And he had already grieved for the boy who could have been his friend once in his lifetime, so Haku's death hadn't hit him quite as hard now. Keiru ran his palm along his right side. His seals were back in place and functioning perfectly, from what he could tell. Keiru was still wondering what his team thought of his elementary explanation of Naruto's strange and sudden strength on the bridge. Obviously, Kakashi knew it for a lie. Keiru was a bit surprised that Sasuke and Sakura had believed it, actually. Thankfully, Tsunami had insisted on lunch before any more questions were asked. Naruto had volunteered to stay behind with Keiru, painting over the broken lines on his side. One good thing about making the excuse of visiting your enemies' graves, Keiru found, was that no one dared to bug you. Even Kakashi, suspicious as he was, had enough respect for the dead not to approach Keiru while he was alone. Although, a familiar prickling sensation on the back of his neck suggested that other teammates were not so courteous. Not nice to sneak up on people, Uchiha, Keiru announced. He glanced over his shoulder and grinned at the dark boy behind him. Especially if you're on the same side. Sasuke just stared back at him with a slight frown as he took in the graves in front of Keiru. "What are you doing?" demanded the boy. "Just thinking." Keiru shrugged and turned away from the graves. He was done talking to ghosts, anyway. "Is it time to go?" Sasuke didn't give an answer, but Keiru didn't really expect one to begin with. They walked side by side in silence while Keiru puzzled how best to talk to a boy he wanted to save without ever hinting that the boy was in danger. After all, he didn't think Sasuke had changed enough yet not to jump at a chance at power. Keiru liked to think Sasuke would at least deliberate a bit by now. "Why did you help me?" Sasuke suddenly blurted. When Keiru looked curiously at the boy, Sasuke explained, "With training." Keiru shoved his hands into his pockets, ignoring the way the new skin on his side stretched uncomfortably. "Why are you so surprised someone did?" he huffed in return. For a genius, Sasuke could be remarkably slow at certain things, mostly involving the people around him. Keiru shook his head and glanced from the corner of his eye at the boy beside him, who was decidedly unhappy at having been answered with another question. "You don't have to do everything on your own, ya know," Sasuke suggested Keiru, hoping Sasuke would catch on. "There are people around who could make you stronger, like your teammates." Hint, hint, Uchiha. Keiru tried not to show that he was watching Sasuke carefully. But Sasuke just glowered at the ground in front of him. Keiru had seen the look directed at him enough times to know that Sasuke found something annoying and didn't want to admit it. "Dobi," Sasuke growled lowly. "I never meant to die for him." The sentiment was so unexpected that Keiru stopped walking. Well, it wasn't too shocking that Sasuke wanted to deny any kind of connection with his teammates. Even years later, Keiru hadn't been able to get a straight answer out of his closest friend as to what was behind that lethal hit for him. Keiru was more shocked that Sasuke had admitted such out loud. "Why not?" Keiru addressed Sasuke's back quietly. Sasuke froze, but he didn't turn around. Keiru knew Sasuke's pain. He knew how badly Sasuke wanted his vengeance, bad enough to keep himself alive for that end. But all things died. Even gods and demons could be brought down. And sacrifice wasn't such a bad thing. Keiru had just been on the receiving end too many times for his tastes. He'd do the same for you, he ventured, because he truly believed that Naruto would give up his life for his team, if not Sasuke in particular quite yet. See all the muscles in Sasuke's back tighten. He wasn't really sure why he had added his own admission to his declaration. Maybe it wasn't the best thing for Sasuke to hear. But if it meant saving Sasuke's soul from the ones he didn't even know about, the ones who all wanted him to dance under their own strings, Keiru would die and do so willingly. "Why?" Sasuke whispered. A handful of answers flitted their way through Keiru's mind, none of which he could actually say out loud. "Because you were the first brother I had. Because I've seen what happens, and it's hell. Because there's no way I'm letting you die again. Because it would hurt too much." Keiru swallowed hard and started walking again. As he passed Sasuke's still form, he remembered the words he had heard once from the boy who was his first and only brother. "How should I know?" answered Keiru. Tazuna stood at the edge of his village, and surveyed his work as he waited for his guests to finish saying goodbye. Hitaki-san had been held up by a young man named Daiki, who had been eyeing the older man's small orange-covered book for the past week. His daughter was talking to the three kids, probably admonishing them to be careful on the journey home, but Naruto's attention was repeatedly snatched up by Inari. Tazuna hadn't seen the boy so excited since before Kaiza had been killed. This ragged team from the hidden village of Konoha, the ones Tazuna was sure more than once would be killed in his defense, they saved Tazuna's village. Keiru finished shaking hands with Gichi, who had come back to work after word got around that Gadu was dead, and walked up to Tazuna. "Hey, nice bridge, old man." Keiru grinned widely and nodded down the length of the stone bridge that reached for the opposite shore. "Looks even better when it's finished." Tazuna liked the young man at his side. Keiru was always smiling, and he worked with his whole heart. In fact, the few times Keiru actually acted like a shinobi was when Tazuna had seen him fighting. Otherwise he acted more like an older brother to the three kids with him and a fellow worker with those on the bridge. He reminded Tazuna a little of Kaiza. Be sure to give it a good name, commanded the young man with a grin. A name? Tazuna hadn't really thought of the name of his bridge yet. He assumed he would name it after himself. Tazuna's Great Bridge. After all, he was the one who organized the thing. But then, Tazuna glanced over at Keiru, who was looking at Naruto and Inari argue over what sounded like the best kind of meal. Naruto was proposing ramen while Inari stuck with yakizakana from the sea that surrounded his island. I was wondering, Keiru-kun, began Tazuna suddenly. Is Uzumaki a well-known name in Konoha? Not very, Keiru scoffed. Naruto was practically born an orphan, and I don't originally come from Konoha. Tazuna noted the young man's uncomfortable pauses in his explanation and frowned. You're not from Konoha? Keiru shook his head glumly and shoved his hands into his pockets. I came to Konoha from the former Whirlpool country to help Naruto, he explained. The former country? Then again, Tazuna thought he remembered something about that. There had once been a country named for the swirling sea at its border. They said only the most skilled sailors could reach it by sea, which was why most people chose to journey across Hai no Kuni to reach the smaller country. But then, the country had simply disappeared from all mention. Everyone stopped talking about it right around the time the Yondaime Mizukage of Kirigakure had gotten violent. But Naruto's name is going to be all over the country one day, announced Keiru, believe it. Tazuna couldn't even call Keiru's tone hopeful. It was too confident, too fierce, for mere hope. He stated it like a fact. His little brother was going to be famous. Well, thank you for having us, Tazuna-san. Hitaki suddenly announced his presence as he stepped up behind Keiru. The red-headed boy jumped slightly, then put out his tongue in a childish sign of petulance. Kakashi just ignored the boy as he smiled, or it looked like he smiled, at Tazuna. Are you sure you have to leave so late? Tsunami inquired, more of the kids she was escorting than the teacher that stood in front of the group now. If we leave already, we'll get back to Konoha by tonight, answered Kakashi, and we have yet to turn our report to our Hokage. Don't worry, Keiru beamed. Now that we have a bridge, it'll be easier to come and visit. Yeah, you guys have to come to Konoha sometime, Naruto agreed loudly. I'll show you Ichiraku's ramen is the best. Ha, whatever. Inari pulled a face at the boy, but his smile afterwards belied his words. Thank you again. Tsunami bowed in the direction of the Konoha Nin as all 5 members of the shinobi team lined up in front of the small family. Jane. Kakashi waved and turned to lead the way back to Konoha. Naruto waved enthusiastically and trotted after his sensei, followed by Sasuke and Sakura as Keiru lifted one hand in farewell and brought up the rear. I like those guys, declared Inari firmly. They were able to help us all, agreed Tsunami, the entire village. Tazuna nodded thoughtfully, keeping his eyes on the retreating figures. That Naruto kid had been able to change Inari's mind about heroes, and even a fool like Tazuna could tell that Keiru had felt the pain of the whole village, the hopelessness that they had resigned themselves to. Hearing the kid's hesitant explanation, Tazuna knew that Keiru had come from a dead country to a living one. No wonder the boy had such hope. Say, this bridge still needs a name, doesn't it? Tazuna pondered to his family. How about the Great Uzumaki Bridge? Whirlpool? Questioned Tsunami. Are you sure you want to name it that? Yeah. Tazuna nodded. In honor of a country that had been forgotten and 2 boys who had restored hope to a country that had lost its faith, Tazuna thought it was completely appropriate. Sarutobi Hiruzen wouldn't quite admit to the relief he felt in seeing Kakashi's Team 7 standing in his office, complete with their temporary ally of Uzumaki Keiru. But he did allow himself to smile in return to Naruto's proud, toothy grin. Hey, we did good, old man, didn't we? The brightest of all this year's genin demanded, his eyes daring anyone to refute him. I'm sure you did, Naruto. It was far easier to smile at someone who was already so enthused. The scroll will tell me the same thing, won't it? He held up the mission report that Kakashi had handed over as soon as the team had entered. He caught Keiru rolling his eyes at the ceiling and wondered if he knew something extra that the scroll contained. Thank you, Team 7. Sarutobi nodded a dismissal towards the young shinobi. He was somewhat unsurprised when Kakashi didn't move from his position. His students noticed his hesitation as well, while Keiru just turned his back on the party in his quest towards the door. Hey, Kakashi-sensei, Naruto started to call. Naruto called Keiru shortly without looking back. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I'm going home. Now, Gaki. Oh. Sudden realization dawned in Naruto's eyes. He scampered after his cousin, giving his teammates a final wave. Sasuke and Sakura followed the other 2 out and back into dusky Konoha, presumably to go home and sleep as well. Once the door was closed behind the genin, Sarutobi laced his fingers together and rested them on his desk. How was the mission, Kakashi? He asked in what would have been a casual manner were it not for the piercing look in his eyes. Interesting. Kakashi stood lazily in the center of the floor with his hands in his pockets. Hiruzen raised his eyebrows. Interesting was hardly a descriptive adjective, and it didn't explain near enough. The C-ranked mission was supposed to be an escort mission. There was no reason for Kakashi's team to be gone more than a week, even if they had been helping on the bridge as Naruto had bragged. Tazuna-san failed to specify THFTER his life, explained Kakashi. The mission became an A rank before we even reached Tazuna's house in Nami. Hiruzen's teeth came together behind his lips. Tasaka Gadu was a name he recognized, if only as a nuisance he needed to keep an eye on because of the closeness of Nami no Kuni to Hai no Kuni's borders. But it was the A-rank declaration that worried the Hokage more. There were complications, Hiruzen confirmed. A total of 4 Kiri Nugnen. Kakashi's slouch belied the serious nature of their discussion. The team took care of the first 2 without much trouble. Then we ran into Momochi Zabua, along with a survivor of the Hyouten bloodline. Hiruzen listened carefully to every inflection, every tone, every word choice that Kakashi used to describe the simple escort mission that had turned into a protection detail, a lesson in chakra control, and, to top it all off, an appearance by the demon residing within Uzumaki Naruto. You didn't see how Keiru reacted to the Kyuubi's chakra? Hiruzen interrupted Kakashi firmly once he had gotten to the point when Keiru disappeared into the mist. No, replied Kakashi. I had captured Zabuza and intended to use Chidori. Haku used his ice mirror to transport in front of Zabuza. I'm sure he was planning to take the blow for his master. Kakashi's gaze darted to gaze out the window behind the sandane for a moment. He had a faraway look in his single eye, and Hiruzen wondered how bad the mission could have been for him. Keiru stopped me before I could kill the boy, Kakashi finished as he looked back to his Hokage. Stopped you? Repeated Hiruzen. He held my wrist while his hand was encased in chakra. Kakashi lifted his right arm and wrapped his fingers around his raised wrist to demonstrate. Wind-natured. Hiruzen nodded. All the elements balanced each other. Lightning was weak against wind. Still, for Keiru to use raw wind chakra instead of molding it into a jutsu suggested that he was wind-natured by default. I can't tell that my Chidori affected him at all, Kakashi continued, but he was already wounded. I see. Hiruzen leaned back in his chair to afford his tense muscles a shift in position, and then? Then Gadu showed up, reported the Junin succinctly. He put a spear through Zabuza. Haku killed Gadu with one of his bloodline techniques. The rest is in the report. That probably meant that there was nothing else imperative. It did sound like most of the enemies Kakashi and his team had been faced with were good enough to kill each other off. And Kakashi was looking for a dismissal. Still, there was an uncomfortable air about him. There was something else about this mission that Kakashi would only tell to the name at the memorial stone. And there is nothing else you wish to add, Kakashi? Hiruzen persisted anyway. Kakashi looked up, and his eye almost turned completely blank, so very different from his normal, smiling state that Sarutobi was sure his heart rate increased. Keiru and Naruto have the same eyes, Kakashi stated nonchalantly, did you notice? Sarutobi had noticed, but he doubted the importance of this sudden revelation. They are reputed to be related, he said calmly instead. Naruto has his father's eyes. The declaration, simply made and delivered, took a full 43 seconds to sink into Hiruzen's mind. He was careful to show absolutely nothing in his visage as he nodded at the Junin before him. Take 3 days respite before your next mission, Kakashi, he ordered. Your team could use it. There were no regulations for genin who had successfully completed an A-rank mission, but all shinobi were expected to rest and recover from a mission of that difficulty. And despite Naruto's ever-present enthusiasm when he had entered the office, Sandane still worried that the boy had taken on and seen too much in his first trip outside of Konoha. Kakashi nodded and turned away without a comment. As the door to his dark office closed, Hiruzen closed his eyes and felt, not for the first time in the past few years, very, very tired. He opened his eyes again and glanced up at the portraits of his predecessors before his gaze fell on the youngest face on the wall. Namikaze Minato was well known for his appearance. Fair-haired and blue-eyed in a village where the strongest bloodlines were all traditionally dark-colored with pale complexions. Naruto did share his father's coloring, and Hiruzen was reminded of that every time the boy came into his office. But the old Hokage hadn't known Uzumaki Kushina that well. She had never risen in the ranks like those around her, although the war provided little opportunity for anything except field promotions when a commander was killed in action. Minato himself was usually careful to avoid crowds when he was in Konoha. He was friendly enough to those he knew, his friends and his comrades, but he was never quite sure what to do with his adoring public, the ones who wanted to thank him for every life they thought he had saved and every good deed he was rumored to have done. As a result, not many people had actually known that he was in love with a foreign kunoichi from Whirlpool. A young woman with bright red hair and green eyes. Hiruzen shook himself out of the past and back into his present predicament. There was no reason a boy who claimed to be related to Uzumaki Kushina should have eyes more like the man she loved. And then there was the new, additional fact that Keiru had somehow calmed Kyuubi's chakra and had his own seals that were unknown to anyone. Hiruzen recognized them for suppressing seals, but if they were truly meant to suppress Keiru's chakra coils, he wouldn't even have enough chakra left to remain alive with the amount of seals on his body. But the boy had specifically stated that his seals kept him alive, much as he hated them. It was too much to consider. Hiruzen knew about seals. Every Hokage was required to know something about just about every method of using chakra. But the Yondaime had been a genius with seals, far above any other cage of any of the elemental countries. The fact that Hiruzen might need someone of the same caliber as Minato to deduce what Keiru's seals were for did not comfort him. He reached into his desk and pulled out a blank scroll. There were 2 places his wayward student regularly checked for news from Konoha while he was traveling. He would need someone who knew both seals and Minato's history, and Jiraiya was the only one left. "You're not adjusting," Keiru called. "This is how Iruka-sensei taught me," Naruto huffed in protest. His cousin had woken him up at an hour usually reserved for roosters and crazy ninja who trained too much. Now, he had Naruto in the training arena that Kakashi-sensei had first tested his team in, running through katas while simultaneously facing off against a Keiru clone. And Naruto was doing it right, no matter what Keiru-ni-san said. "Yeah, but what if you're fighting someone taller than you?" Keiru pushed himself off his seat on the grass and winced as he braced one hand on his left knee. Naruto relaxed and chewed on his lip briefly. Keiru hadn't let him check his seals since the day he had painted over the wound, that same day that Keiru had made up a story to tell Sasuke and Sakura-chan. Naruto was pretty sure that Kakashi knew the story was a lie, since he looked old enough to know the truth, although the way he acted didn't always match up with his gray hair. But Sasuke and Sakura-chan seemed to believe it, so that was a relief. He didn't really want to have to tell them that the greatest disaster to hit Konoha since the last war was actually contained inside their teammate. "They're not gonna bend down just so you can punch them in the jaw." Keiru approached Naruto and continued with his explanation. "What are you gonna do like that, bite my ankles?" Naruto stuck out his tongue at the ridiculous suggestion, but his happy mood didn't last long. "Hey, Ni-san," he called quietly, "you sure you're okay?" Keiru frowned at the boy in a way Naruto knew suggested puzzlement more than any, replied the older boy, "Why?" Keiru cut himself off and gave Naruto a searching look. Like he was looking right through Naruto, past the seal and the smile and everything. "Are you thinking about what happened on the bridge?" A lot of things had happened on the bridge, but somehow Naruto knew exactly what Keiru was talking about. That feeling of having his insides burn, like his blood was on fire, and wanting to hurt someone so badly that his mouth watered because of it. Naruto felt a shiver travel the length of his spine, from the back of his neck down past his shoulder, and stared at the ground in front of his feet. "Naruto, you know what happened then, right?" Keiru wasn't moving, so Naruto couldn't tell if he was angry. Then again, he didn't think he had ever seen his cousin really angry. He got annoyed sometimes, and he was serious about the guys he had been fighting in Wave, but not angry. "That was..." Naruto started then stopped to swallow. "That was the Kyuubi, right?" He thought it was the Kyuubi, he was pretty sure it was the Kyuubi. At any rate, that evil feeling couldn't have come from him, right? "Yeah, that was Kyuubi," Keiru answered solemnly. "Or Kyuubi's chakra. That seal of Yondaime's makes it so that you can pull out Kyuubi's chakra in extreme circumstances." Really, Naruto wondered how Keiru knew so much about Kyuubi, but he had said that Sandame Gigi told him about the fox and how it was sealed into Naruto. Maybe Sandame knew more about it as well. "Yeah, but it can also get out if you're really angry or upset." Keiru suddenly knelt down in front of Naruto and stared at the boy. "Naruto, you can't let that happen." Keiru sounded so deathly serious that Naruto had to look up. Keiru's face had that tired look again, the one he got when he was staring at the seals on his arms sometimes. "You can't depend on that strength," he commanded. "That kind of chakra isn't meant to mix with humans. Every time you use it, it'll cut back on your lifespan." Naruto blinked and studied his cousin carefully, remembering what he had said to explain the markings on both his arms and his body. "Is that what happened to you, Keiru-ni?" Keiru's shoulders jerked with tension as his light eyes widened suddenly. Then, his shoulders slumped back down. "Yeah," he answered. "Something like that." Keiru rested one hand on his knee and pushed himself to his feet again. "That's enough of a break," announced the redhead suddenly. "Try it again. And remember to overcompensate, okay?" "Okay." Naruto nodded firmly and switched his mind from evil chakra and body-destroying demons back to the proper way to punch someone who was at least 20 centimeters taller than him. Keiru didn't make any shadow clones, which let Naruto focus solely on the older boy as he danced around the younger. Naruto was pretty sure that the 2 times he had hit Keiru, once on his right shoulder and once he just grazed the left side of Keiru's stomach, were only because Keiru had let him. But then, Keiru grabbed the front of Naruto's orange jacket and lifted the boy up so that his toes were barely grazing the ground. Naruto panicked for a moment before a more primal instinct kicked in and he urged all the muscles in his neck to jerk forward. "Nawag!" Keiru cried as he dropped his captive and covered his bleeding nose with his hand. Naruto landed easily on his feet and rushed forward even as Keiru backed away, more concerned about Keiru's bleeding than the pressure on his own head from where his forehead had collided with Keiru's nose. "Keiru-ni, you okay?" he demanded. "I'm fine, Gaki." Kaoru tilted his head back and swiped the excess blood from his upper lip. Don't worry, that's what a hite 8 is for. The teenager looked back down at Naruto and pinched the skin between his mouth and nose. See, it's already stopped. He held out his bloody fingers to show Naruto. Besides, we got an audience. Naruto turned and followed the older gaze over his shoulder to the dark boy hovering at the edge of the green training grounds. Naruto glared hotly at the interruption of his lesson with Kaoru-ni-san. What are you doing here, Sasuke Teme? Naruto yelled with a finger pointed rudely at his teammate. You don't have a monopoly on training grounds, Dobi, retorted Sasuke snidely. Naruto wasn't quite sure what Sasuke was saying about the training grounds, but he could discern an insult from Sasuke any day. That's enough, Kaoru stated suddenly with his clean hand on Naruto's shoulder. It's a day off, right? Naruto pouted but obediently let the matter go. It was a day off, and he wasn't going to waste it by fighting with Sasuke. Kaoru swiped his blood-stained fingers on his dark pants and used his sleeve to wipe the last of the drying blood from his face. You know, he began thoughtfully, I think I still owe you 2 ramen. Yeah, Naruto's eyes widened in realization. We mastered the tree climbing, Kaoru-ni-san. You owe us. Yeah, sure. Kaoru's grin stretched out his cheeks. We'll go to Ichiraku's. Naruto let out a whoop and pumped his fist in the air. Ramen definitely made up for a shortened lesson, even with Kaoru. He led the way off the field, followed by Kaoru who stopped to wave to Sasuke as they both passed him. Come on then, Sasuke Teme. Kaoru grinned as he emphasized Naruto's best name for the Uchiha. Sasuke scowled as he shoved his hands into his pockets. I don't like ramen, the boy growled. Naruto glanced over his shoulder to scowl Sasuke. Who didn't like ramen? Too bad. Kaoru just shrugged. It's what I promised. Besides, the way he eats, I won't be able to afford anything else. Naruto suddenly transferred his scowl from Sasuke to Kaoru. He just knew his cousin was talking about him, but it wasn't Naruto's fault that he liked ramen so much. It was a good meal, cheap so he could actually afford to buy it, and he got hungry, so of course he had to have more than one bowl. Besides, Kaoru was paying this time, so Naruto would put up sitting with the bastard for a little while at least. The trip to Ichiraku's ramen stand ended up being a Team 7 thing instead of a Kaoru treating Naruto and Sasuke thing. But Kaoru hadn't been able to say no when Sakura almost literally stumbled on the 3 boys and accepted Naruto's impromptu invitation to join them, which Kaoru suspected was more due to the fact that Sasuke hadn't protested rather than Naruto's enthusiasm. Still, maybe it was an accomplishment in and of itself, the fact that all 3 members of Team 7 were sitting at a restaurant together and not fighting. Well, the fact that Kaoru had planted himself between Sakura and Naruto to prevent any bopping of heads probably helped with the lack of fighting. Unfortunately, the setup also forced Sasuke to take the stool next to his biggest fan. The Uchiha already looked a little peeved at Kaoru. Now, if only Kaoru could perform some kind of jutsu that would make these 3 become suddenly fast friends. Kaoru stifled a chuckle in his noodles. Wishful thinking. He wondered if anyone else thought he was crazy with his laughing to himself. Yo! Kaoru turned and mentally noted that, laughter or not, he would never be as crazy as some of the Junin of Konoha. Hello, Kakashi-sensei. Sakura recovered quickly enough to remaining the most polite of Team 7. Sasuke barely grunted at his teacher, while Naruto was too busy slurping down his mouthful of noodles to speak properly, although his chopstick wave could be considered a greeting, maybe. Kakashi-sensei. Kaoru greeted the gray-haired man who had just entered the noodle stand. Are we late? Kakashi cocked his head slightly as his eyes crinkled from a hidden grin. For what? He inquired innocently. That was my next question, commented Kaoru with a slight frown. I thought this was a day off. It wasn't that unusual that a Junin sensei would seek out his team, but Kakashi had been more of a hands-off kind of teacher in the beginning. Kaoru sometimes wondered what his sensei thought of when he looked at his team. But then care what little he knew of what his sensei had seen before he ever met Team 7 and decided that he didn't want to know. We didn't have a meeting today, Kakashi answered Kaoru's original query. I just wanted to make sure you reported in with Naruto in 2 days for our next mission. Really? Naruto practically shot straight up in his seat. Cool? Kaoru avoided shaking his head, but he still thought it was fun how easily the kid got riled up. Were he not so worried about appearing way too eager for a chance to be with Konoha's jinchuriki, he'd be acting the same way. Being on the same team as the one hope he had for the future wasn't quite in his plans, but then again, Kaoru couldn't remember the last time he had a plan, much less one that had actually worked the way it was supposed to. Don't suppose you know what kind of mission? Kaoru asked in a lilting voice. We'll probably have a D rank again, replied the Junin, to give you guys a chance to recover. Kaoru nodded. It made sense, especially since he really couldn't remember any mission in particular standing out between the wave mission and the start of the only Chunin exams he had ever taken. That experience was engraved pretty firmly in his mind. Hey, we're all healthy. Naruto protested suddenly. See, Kakashi-sensei. Even Sasuke Teme. The boy jabbed a finger around the people in his way to point out his teammate, sitting with his face clean of bandages and only a scrape on his forehead to prove that he had ever been injured. Naruto. Sakura cried in reprimand, probably more because of the name than Naruto's protests that his team was field ready. Kakashi-sensei, Kaoru called as Sakura raised her fist. You haven't joined us for ramen yet. All eyes, even Sasuke's, turned their attention to the nonchalant man in the ramen stand. Kakashi slowly tapped one finger on his covered chin and tilted his head thoughtfully. Well, I suppose I could have one bowl. As Kakashi took a seat on Naruto's free side, at the end of the counter, Kaoru leaned over his opposite side and whispered the magic words. Calm down, Sakura-chan, he murmured. If we can get Kakashi-sensei to eat, we can see what his face looks like under his mask. Sakura's eyes widened. Really? She covered up her curiosity with a dubious frown. Hook. This is childish, Sasuke grumbled, but a faint line of pink across his cheekbones proved that he was paying more attention to his surroundings than he wanted to admit. Line. One bowl of miso, please, Kakashi stated to the old man behind the counter. Naruto leaned in toward his friends conspiratorially. He's gonna take off his mask, the boy whispered, excitement lacing his tones. Sasuke and Sakura both looked at Kakashi then schooled their eyes in front of them, trying desperately to look nonchalant. And sinker, Kaoru thought. He didn't mind that his team was coming together over something as simple as ramen and the mysteries of their sensei's face. He couldn't even bring himself to mind that he was included in this game this time around in a time and place where Kaoru shouldn't exist. It was enough that Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura were finally acting like they were friends. Although, Kaoru still couldn't keep from laughing long and hard when Iruka-sensei leaned into the ramen shop and inquired after his former students, conveniently blocking their view of Kakashi-sensei while he ate.